Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin tonight in Greece. And before your brain goes straight to the Parthenon or the Olympics or the marble statues or the philosophical dialogues that half the Western intellectual tradition is still arguing about, I need you to understand something that most accounts of ancient Greece get fundamentally wrong. Ancient Greece was not a single civilization. It was a collection of hundreds of independent city-states, each with its own laws, its own customs, its own calendar, its own currency, its own gods, its own specific theory of what a good human life required, and its own set of rules that were simultaneously products of that specific theory and the practical necessities of a specific community trying to survive and flourish in a specific geographic and political environment. The rules of Sparta were not the rules of Athens. The rules of Corinth were not the rules of Thebes. The rules of the tiny island of Aegina were not the rules of the vast territory of Macedon. To speak of ancient Greek rules as if they were a single coherent system is to misunderstand the most fundamental fact about the civilization that produced them. What the Greek city-states shared was not a common legal system. It was a common language, a common body of mythology, a common set of religious festivals and sanctuaries that were recognized across the political divisions, and a common understanding that the questions worth asking about human life were the questions about justice and virtue and the good society and the proper relationship between the individual and the community that their philosophers were the first in the Western tradition to pose with systematic rigor. The rules were different, the questions that generated them were the same. So if you are ready, let us step into the most intellectually productive civilization the ancient Western world produced, and find out what it was actually like to live there. Starting as always with the rules, if you wake up as an Athenian citizen in the year 430 before our era, at the height of the Periclean Golden Age, when the Parthenon is being completed on the Acropolis and Sophocles is writing his tragedies, and Socrates is walking the agora asking uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and virtue and piety that will eventually get him killed, the first thing you notice is that your identity as a citizen is not simply a legal status. It is a total description of who you are and what you owe and what you are owed. Athenian citizenship in the classical period was an extraordinarily exclusive club. It was restricted to men whose fathers and mothers were both Athenian citizens. It could not be purchased. It could not be awarded for services rendered, with extremely rare exceptions. It could not be inherited through the maternal line if the father was not a citizen. And it could be lost through specific categories of conduct that the Athenian legal system treated as incompatible with the rights and responsibilities that citizenship entailed. The rules that defined citizenship were the rules that defined Athens itself, because Athens in the classical period was understood as a community of citizens, not as a territory or a state in the modern sense. The agora, the open public space at the center of the city where political, commercial, religious, and social life converged, was the physical expression of that community. The rules about who could use the agora and how were therefore rules about who was fully Athenian and in what ways. Citizens had access to the agora in ways that metics, the resident foreigners who made up a significant portion of the Athenian population, and slaves did not. The physical space of the agora was organized to express and reinforce the hierarchies of citizenship that organized Athenian political life. The rules of the Athenian ekklesia, the assembly of citizens that was the primary decision-making body of the Athenian democracy, are among the most remarkable in the ancient world, and are worth examining in considerable detail because they represent the first large-scale experiment in direct democracy in human history, and because the specific rules that governed that experiment reveal both its extraordinary achievements and its specific limitations with equal clarity. Every male Athenian citizen over the age of 18 had the right to attend the ekklesia, to speak in the ekklesia, and to vote in the ekklesia, not the right to elect a representative who would attend and speak and vote on his behalf, the right to do it himself. The ekklesia met approximately 40 times per year at the Pnyx, a hillside auditorium west of the Acropolis that could accommodate several thousand people. The agenda for each meeting was published in advance so that citizens could prepare their arguments. Any citizen who wished to speak could request to do so. And the decisions of the majority were binding on the entire community. The rules about who could speak in the ekklesia were less restrictive than you might expect given the general hierarchical character of ancient Athenian society. A citizen who had been convicted of certain crimes, including cowardice in battle, failure to maintain his parents in old age, and the specific category of offences that the Athenians called atimia, the loss of civic honour, lost the right to speak in the assembly even if he retained other aspects of citizenship. But any citizen in good standing could speak regardless of his wealth or his birth, or his education or his previous experience in public life. The wealthy and the educated and the experienced tended to speak more effectively, because effective public speaking required skills that were easier to acquire with resources and education, but the right to speak was not restricted to them. The rules about the ostracism procedure are one of the most characteristically Athenian inventions in the entire history of political institutions. Ostracism was a procedure by which the Athenian people could vote to exile any citizen for a period of 10 years without accusing him of any crime, without conducting any trial, and without providing any explanation beyond the simple fact that a majority of those voting had decided that his absence from Athens for a decade would benefit the city. The procedure was named for the ostrakon, the pottery shard on which citizens scratched the name of the person they wanted to exile. Each spring, the ekklesia would vote on whether to hold an ostracism that year. If the vote was yes, 2 months later a special assembly would be held at which each citizen who attended could scratch a name on a pottery shard and deposit it in a designated area. If at least 6,000 ostraca were deposited, the person whose name appeared most frequently was exiled for 10 years. The rules governing ostracism reveal a specific Athenian anxiety about the concentration of political power in a single individual that was connected to the historical memory of tyranny, the experience of rule by a single powerful man that Athens had undergone under the Pasistratid dynasty in the generation before the democracy was established. The Athenians had seen what happened when a single citizen accumulated enough personal power and popular support to dominate the political life of the city, and they had developed the ostracism procedure as a specific institutional mechanism for preventing any future citizen from reaching that level of dominance. You did not need to have done anything wrong to be ostracized. You needed only to have become sufficiently prominent, sufficiently powerful, or sufficiently divisive that a majority of the voting citizens preferred to have you out of Athens for the next decade. The specific individuals who were ostracized reveal what kinds of prominence made Athenians nervous. Themistocles, the architect of the Greek victory at Salamis, and one of the most consequential strategists in Athenian history, was ostracized in the 470s. Aristides, known as Aristides the Just for his personal integrity, was ostracized around 482. The story that Plutarch tells about his ostracism, which may be apocryphal but which is too perfectly revealing of the procedure's logic to ignore, has an illiterate farmer approaching Aristides during the ostracism vote and asking him to scratch the name Aristides on his pottery shard. Aristides asks the farmer if Aristides has wronged him in any way. The farmer says no, he doesn't even know the man, but he is tired of hearing everyone call him the Just. Aristides scratches his own name on the shard and hands it back without revealing who he is. The story captures something genuine about the ostracism procedure. It was not about guilt, it was about prominence. And excessive prominence, even the prominence of excessive virtue, made Athenians uncomfortable. The rules about the Athenian jury system reveal a democracy that was serious about popular justice in ways that no modern democratic system has replicated at the same scale. Athenian courts did not have professional judges. They had citizen juries of hundreds of people, sometimes thousands, drawn by lot from the annual pool of citizens who had registered for jury duty. The size of the juries was not accidental. Large juries were harder to bribe than small ones, and the Athenians were acutely aware of the corrupting effects of concentrated decision-making power. A jury of 500 citizens drawn by lot from across the citizen body was not impossible to bribe in theory, but it was practically impossible to bribe in the time available between the announcement of the jury composition and the holding of the trial. The rules about how trials were conducted in Athens reveal a legal system that was simultaneously more democratic and less professional than anything the modern world has produced. There were no lawyers in the modern sense. Each party presented his own case, though he could hire a speechwriter to compose the speech he would deliver himself. There were no rules of evidence in the modern sense. A speaker could say almost anything he believed would persuade the jury, including appeals to the jury's pity, arguments about his past service to Athens, and character assessments of the opposing party that would be inadmissible in any modern court. The jury voted by secret ballot at the conclusion of the speeches, with no deliberation, no instructions from a judge about the applicable law, and no opportunity to ask questions of the witnesses. The majority ruled, and the verdict was immediate and final. The rules about the specific crimes that Athenian law punished most severely reveal what the Athenians valued most. Impiety, the failure to honor the gods correctly, was a capital offense that was taken extremely seriously. Socrates was convicted of impiety and executed for it in 399 before our era, which is the most famous application of the impiety law in Athenian history, but by no means the only one. The specific charges against Socrates, that he failed to acknowledge the gods that the city acknowledged and that he introduced new divine beings, were charges that addressed his philosophical practice directly. His habit of saying that he was guided by a personal divine sign, the daimonion, was understood as the introduction of a new divine entity that had not been officially recognized. His questioning of the traditional accounts of the gods in his philosophical conversations was understood as a failure to give those gods the acknowledgement they were due. The rules about the treatment of the dead reveal an Athenian understanding of the obligations the living owed to the dead that was both deeply felt and practically enforced. A person who died in Athens without proper burial rites was understood to be in genuine danger of remaining trapped in a liminal state between the world of the living and the world of the dead, unable to cross the river Styx to reach the underworld because the ferryman Charon would not transport the unburied. The obligation to bury the dead properly was therefore not simply a social convention. It was a theological obligation whose failure had consequences in the cosmic accounting that extended beyond the individual to affect the community as a whole. The rule that generated the most dramatic political conflict in Athenian history connected to this obligation was the rule that a general who failed to recover the bodies of his fallen soldiers for proper burial was criminally liable for that failure. After the naval battle of Arginusae in 406 before our era, at which the Athenian fleet defeated a Spartan fleet in one of the largest naval engagements of the Peloponnesian War, a storm prevented the Athenian commanders from recovering the bodies of the sailors who had drowned in the battle. The ekklesia voted to try all 6 victorious generals collectively on a single charge of failing to recover the dead, in a procedure that violated the Athenian legal rule that each person accused of a capital crime was entitled to a separate trial. Socrates, who happened to be serving as one of the Prytanes, the committee that managed the agenda of the ekklesia, on that day was the only official who refused to put the illegal collective trial to a vote. All 6 generals were convicted and executed. The decision was widely regarded as a grave injustice almost immediately after it was made. And the specific incident illuminates with particular clarity the tension that ran through the entire Athenian political system between the rule of law and the will of the majority. The rules about Athenian education, the paideia, were not imposed by the state in the way that Spartan education was imposed by the state. Athenian education was primarily a private matter managed by individual families according to their means and their values. The state specified certain basic expectations that boys would receive instruction in music and gymnastics and letters, but the specific form of that instruction was left to families and private teachers rather than organized by a state curriculum. What this meant in practice was that the quality and content of education varied enormously by wealth and by family values, with wealthy families able to afford the services of the most accomplished teachers and poor families limited to the most basic instruction. The rules about the gymnasium, the public exercise facility that was a central institution of Greek civic life, reveal a dimension of Athenian social organization that is easy to misunderstand from a modern perspective. The gymnasium was not simply a place for physical exercise. It was a place for philosophical conversation, for the formation of the social bonds between older and younger men that were central to the transmission of Athenian cultural values, and for the display and cultivation of the physical excellence that the Greek tradition associated with the development of the whole human being. The rules about who could use the gymnasium and how were therefore rules about the full range of what the Athenians understood the gymnasium to be for. The specific rules about the relationship between an older man, the Aristides, and the younger man, the Eromenos, that was culturally recognized and regulated in the gymnasium context, are among the most difficult aspects of Athenian culture for modern readers to engage with honestly. The relationship was understood as a form of mentorship, in which the older man was responsible for the younger man's education in the full sense of the term, his intellectual development, his moral formation, and his initiation into the responsibilities and relationships of adult civic life. The rules about what was permitted in this relationship and what was not were specific and seriously observed, at least in theory. The sexual dimension of the relationship was heavily regulated, and its specific character was a matter of considerable philosophical discussion among the Athenians themselves, with Plato's dialogues engaging extensively, and not always consistently with the question of what the relationship should properly involve. The rules about Athenian women reveal a society that was considerably more restrictive in its treatment of women than the modern Western democratic tradition that claims descent from it. Athenian women of citizen families were expected to remain within the domestic sphere, to avoid unnecessary contact with men outside the family, to manage the household rather than to participate in public life, and to have their public roles defined almost entirely by their relationships to their male relatives. They could not vote, could not hold office, could not speak in the assembly, could not appear in court on their own behalf, and were under the legal guardianship of a male relative throughout their lives. The rules about the management of the oikos, the household, were therefore the rules within which most Athenian women of citizen families lived their lives. The oikos was not simply a residence, it was an economic unit, a religious unit, and a social unit, whose correct management was understood as a genuine and important skill. The mistress of the household was responsible for the management of the domestic slaves, the organization of food production and storage, the oversight of weaving and other domestic production, the management of household finances, and the organization of the domestic religious observances that connected the household to the divine. These were real responsibilities with real consequences, and the Athenian understanding of the household valued the woman who managed it well in ways that the public invisibility of women might obscure. The Athenian rules about slaves reveal a society that was economically dependent on slavery in ways that shaped every other aspect of its social organization. The Athenian democracy, with its remarkable political freedoms, its cultural achievements, its philosophical sophistication, and its extraordinary material prosperity, was built on a foundation of enslaved labor, whose scale and whose conditions of existence were genuinely terrible by any humane standard. Estimates of the slave population of Athens in the classical period range widely, but a commonly cited figure is approximately 100,000 slaves in a total population of perhaps 300,000 people. Approximately 1 in 3 persons in Athens was enslaved. The rules about slaves in Athenian law were organized around the principle that slaves were property rather than persons, which had specific practical consequences for how the law treated them. A slave could not own property. A slave could not enter into a contract. A slave could not appear in court on his or her own behalf. A slave's testimony in legal proceedings was admissible only if obtained under torture, on the theory that a slave would tell the truth only when physical pain made lying impossible. The rules about the torture of slaves for testimony were specific about the procedures and the presence of representatives of both parties during the torture, creating a formal legal mechanism for the infliction of pain on human beings that was understood as a standard feature of the legal system rather than an exceptional measure. The rules about the specific treatment that was prohibited with respect to slaves reveal what the Athenian system considered the outer limits of acceptable slave treatment. A master who killed his slave was not subject to murder charges in the ordinary sense, but could face a charge of impiety connected to the religious pollution that the killing of any human being created, regardless of that person's legal status. A master who treated a slave with excessive cruelty could face social censure even if the legal consequences were limited. And a slave who was sufficiently mistreated could seek refuge at certain religious sanctuaries, where the master was prohibited from removing him by force and could request to be sold to a different owner, which was a very limited form of protection that acknowledged the slave's status as something more than a simple object. The rules about the metics, the resident foreigners who lived in Athens without citizen status, reveal a society that was considerably more open to economic participation by non-citizens than it was to political participation. Metics could own businesses, could engage in trade, could practice crafts, and could accumulate wealth. They were required to pay a specific tax, the metoikion, that marked their non-citizen status and their obligation to contribute to the city in lieu of the civic service that citizens were expected to perform. They could not own land in Attica. They could not participate in the political life of the city. And they were under the legal protection of a citizen patron, the prostates, who was responsible for representing them in legal proceedings in ways that paralleled the guardianship relationship that governed the legal situation of Athenian women. The rules about Athenian religious practice reveal a system that was simultaneously remarkably tolerant of diversity in personal belief and absolutely insistent on the correct performance of public religious obligations. The Athenian understanding of religion was not primarily about personal belief in the modern sense. It was about the correct performance of the rituals and ceremonies that maintained the relationship between the community and the gods on whom the community depended. What you privately believed about the gods was your own business. What you publicly performed in the civic religious calendar was the community's business and was subject to collective enforcement. The Panathenaic festival, held every 4 years as a grand celebration of Athenian civic identity, combined athletic competitions, musical contests, a grand procession to the Acropolis, and the presentation of a new robe to the statue of Athena in the Parthenon, in a series of rules and ceremonies that made participation in the festival a performance of Athenian identity as much as a religious observance. The rules about who could participate in which aspects of the festival, which categories of people could compete in which events, how the procession was organized, and in what order different groups marched, were rules about the social hierarchy of Athens expressed through the medium of religious ceremony. The Eleusinian Mysteries, the most important and most secret religious institution of classical Athens, had rules about participation and silence that were among the most seriously enforced in the ancient world. The Mysteries were the secret initiatory rites of Demeter and Persephone, performed at Eleusis, a city about 20 kilometers from Athens, every year in the autumn. The initiates were required to undergo a series of ritual preparations, to make specific offerings, to participate in a nocturnal ceremony, whose specific content was never to be revealed under any circumstances, and to maintain absolute silence about what they had experienced for the remainder of their lives. The rules about secrecy were not simply conventional. Revealing the mysteries was a capital offense. The Athenian general Alcibiades was prosecuted in absentia for allegedly parodying the mysteries at a private drinking party, which was taken as a grave religious offense even though the parody occurred in private. What the mysteries contained, what the initiates experienced in the nocturnal ceremony that left so many of the most sophisticated people in the ancient world, describing it as one of the most profound experiences of their lives, is not known with certainty because the rules of secrecy were so effectively maintained that no detailed account has survived. We know from indirect evidence that there were things shown, things said, and things done in the ceremony. We know that the experience was understood as a form of preparation for death, as a preview of the conditions of the afterlife that changed the initiate's relationship to their own mortality. And we know that the rules of silence were observed with a fidelity that is genuinely remarkable, given that hundreds of thousands of people over several centuries underwent the initiation, and apparently none of them broke the rule in any detailed way that was recorded. The rules about Athenian drama and the theatrical festivals of Dionysus reveal the specific form that the Athenian understanding of the relationship between art and civic life took. The great dramatic festivals, the city Dionysia in the spring and the Linnea in winter, were not simply cultural events. They were religious festivals, organized by the state, funded partly by the state and partly by wealthy citizens who were selected to serve as chorigos, the producer who financed the training and costuming of the chorus for a specific production. The rules about who served as chorigos were the rules about civic obligation that applied to wealthy Athenians more generally. A wealthy citizen who was selected to serve as chorigos was not being honored. He was being required to spend his personal wealth in the service of the community's religious and cultural life, and his reputation among his fellow citizens was affected by how generously and how effectively he fulfilled the obligation. The dramatic performances themselves were competitions judged by panels of citizens selected by lot. The rules about what the plays could contain were not censorship rules in the modern sense. Athenian playwrights addressed the most politically sensitive and most theologically contentious topics of their age, with a directness that no modern publicly funded artistic institution would attempt. Aristophanes' comedies attacked specific living politicians by name and in ways that were personally insulting and politically damaging. Euripides' tragedies questioned the traditional accounts of the gods in ways that came close to impiety. Sophocles' Antigone raised directly the question of the conflict between the obligations of family and the obligations of state in a way that was immediately relevant to the specific political tensions of Athenian democracy. The rules permitted this because the dramatic festival was understood as a space in which the community could examine its own values and contradictions in a form that was simultaneously entertaining, politically engaged, and religiously framed. The rules about the Athenian symposium, the formal drinking party that was the primary institution of elite male social life in classical Athens, are among the most revealing in the entire corpus of Athenian social regulation. The symposium was not simply a party. It was a carefully structured social ritual with specific rules about how the wine was to be mixed, what topics were appropriate for discussion, what forms of entertainment were permitted, and what the specific obligations of host and guests were toward each other. The wine at a Greek symposium was never drunk undiluted. The rules about the mixing of wine and water were specific, and the ratio was determined at each symposium by the symposiar, the master of the symposium chosen at the beginning of the evening. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, a mark of the failure to achieve the moderation that Greek culture associated with civilized life. The ratio of water to wine varied depending on how much intoxication the symposiar wanted to encourage and how long the evening was expected to last. A ratio of 3 parts water to 1 part wine was considered very moderate. A ratio of 1 part water to 1 part wine was considered fairly strong. And the rule that all guests drank from the same mix ensured that the level of intoxication in the room was relatively uniform, which served the social function of preventing any individual from becoming significantly more or less intoxicated than the group. The rules about what could be discussed at the symposium were more permissive than the rules of most other social contexts. Philosophy, poetry, music, erotic discourse, political argument, personal gossip, mythological speculation, and all manner of intellectual game-playing were all appropriate symposium topics. The rules of the symposium created a specific social space that was set apart from the ordinary rules of public discourse, and in which a specific form of unconstrained but structured conversation was possible. Plato's dialogue The Symposium, which sets a philosophical discussion of the nature of love in the framework of a symposium, is the most famous exploitation of this institutional context, but it reflects a genuine feature of what the symposium was understood to be for. The rules about the heterai, the educated courtesans who attended symposia and who occupied a unique social position in Athenian society, reveal the specific ways in which the restrictions on respectable citizen women created space for women who operated outside those restrictions to achieve a form of social influence that citizen women could not access. The hetera was not simply a prostitute in the modern sense. She was a woman who had chosen or been placed by circumstance in a position outside the household economy that governed the lives of citizen women, and who provided companionship. The rules about money and commerce in Athens reveal a society that was considerably more commercially sophisticated than the Confucian tradition's discomfort with commerce might suggest, and whose commercial rules reflected a practical understanding of the requirements of long-distance trade and credit that had been developing in the Greek world since the Archaic period. Athens in the classical period was a major commercial centre, whose port at Piraeus was one of the busiest in the Mediterranean world. The rules about banking, about maritime loans, about commercial arbitration, and about the enforcement of commercial contracts were developed to manage the specific challenges of a commercial economy that extended across the entire Mediterranean and into the Black Sea. The maritime loan, the bottomry loan, was one of the most important commercial instruments in the Athenian economy, and its rules reveal the specific risk management considerations of long-distance sea trade. A bottomry loan was a loan made to a merchant to finance a trading voyage, with the ship and its cargo as collateral, and with the specific condition that if the ship was lost at sea, the loan did not have to be repaid. The interest rate on a bottomry loan was substantially higher than the interest rate on a regular loan, reflecting the risk that the lender was taking by accepting that the loss of the ship would cancel the debt. The rules about bottomry loans were specified in contracts that were witnessed and stored in archives, and the disputes that arose from them were a significant portion of the business of the Athenian commercial courts. Now let us move from Athens to Persia, because the Persian Empire that Athens fought and defeated and competed with was not the barbaric despotism that the Athenian rhetorical tradition portrayed it as being. It was one of the most sophisticated and most administratively accomplished empires in the ancient world, whose rules about the management of diversity, about the treatment of conquered peoples, about the organization of provincial administration, and about the relationship between the imperial center and its subject populations were in many respects considerably more sophisticated than anything Athens produced in its comparatively tiny territory. If you wake up as a satrap, a provincial governor of the Persian Achaemenid Empire in the year 470 before our era, during the reign of Xerxes, you are responsible for governing a province that might contain millions of people speaking dozens of languages, following dozens of different religions, organized by dozens of different legal traditions, and producing dozens of different agricultural and craft products that are all subject to the imperial taxation system that funds the enormous apparatus of the empire. Your job is not to impose Persian culture on all of these people. Your job is to extract their taxes, maintain their obedience, keep the peace among them, and transmit reliable information about conditions in your province to the royal court at Persepolis. The rules about how you do this reflect an imperial philosophy that was genuinely different from the approach of most ancient empires, and that produced genuinely different outcomes. The Achaemenid policy of religious tolerance was one of the most consequential features of Persian imperial rule, and one of the most specifically unusual in the ancient world. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 before our era, he did not suppress the Babylonian religion or impose the worship of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of the Zoroastrian tradition that was the religion of the Persian ruling class. He issued the Cyrus Cylinder, one of the earliest surviving documents of religious and political self-presentation in history, in which he described himself as the chosen instrument of Marduk, the chief Babylonian god who had selected Cyrus to restore the proper worship of Marduk, after the impious conduct of the last Babylonian king. Cyrus was simultaneously describing himself in Persian terms as the chosen of Ahura Mazda, and in Babylonian terms as the chosen of Marduk, presenting his conquest as an act of divine restoration rather than divine imposition. The rules that this policy created for the administration of conquered territories were rules about accommodation rather than assimilation. Local temples were to be maintained and their rituals continued. Local legal customs were to be respected where they did not conflict with imperial authority. Local elites were to be incorporated into the imperial administrative structure where possible, rather than replaced by Persian administrators. The Jewish exiles in Babylon were permitted to return to Judah and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem under a decree of Cyrus that is recorded in the Hebrew Bible, and that was, as far as can be determined from the available evidence, a genuine expression of the same policy of religious accommodation that Cyrus applied to every conquered people. The rules about the imperial road system, the royal road that connected the western edge of the empire at Sardis in Anatolia to the royal capital at Susa in Persia, a distance of approximately 2,700 kilometers, were the practical expression of an imperial philosophy that understood control of information and rapid communication as the foundations of imperial authority. The royal road was maintained by the state, with relay stations at regular intervals where fresh horses and riders were available for the royal messengers who carried imperial dispatches along it. The rules about the maintenance of these relay stations, about the priority given to royal messengers, and about the penalties for interfering with the royal messenger service were specific and seriously enforced. Herodotus, the Greek historian who is our primary source for the Persian Wars, described the Persian royal messenger service in terms that expressed genuine admiration for its efficiency. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevent these couriers from completing their designated stages with utmost speed, he wrote, in a phrase that was later adapted for the inscription on the main post office building in New York City, and that has been associated with postal services ever since. The specific rules that made the messenger service work as efficiently as Herodotus described were rules about the organization of the relay system, the quality of the horses maintained at each station, the specific credentials that gave royal messengers priority over all other traffic on the road, and the penalties for station masters who failed to maintain the service at the required level. The rules about the Persian imperial administration at the level of the satrap reveal a system that was considerably more sophisticated in its management of provincial diversity than most ancient empires. Each satrapy had a satrap who was responsible for overall administration, a military commander who was responsible for the troops stationed in the satrapy, and who reported directly to the king rather than to the satrap, and a secretary who maintained records and correspondence that went directly to the royal court. This three-way division of authority at the provincial level was a deliberate structural check on the power of any individual official to accumulate enough authority to threaten the imperial centre. The satrap, who had total control of both the civil administration and the military forces in his province, was a satrap who was potentially in a position to rebel. The satrap, whose military commander reported independently to the king, was a satrap whose military power was limited in ways that reduced the risk of provincial rebellion. The rules about the Persian court at Persepolis reveal an institution of extraordinary elaborateness and deliberate symbolic power that was designed to express the authority of the Achaemenid kings over the diverse peoples of their empire in a visual and ceremonial language that could be understood across cultural boundaries. The audience relief at Persepolis, which shows the Persian king receiving delegations from the subject peoples of the empire, each depicted in their distinctive ethnic dress and each bringing tribute appropriate to the products of their specific territory, is one of the most explicitly designed pieces of imperial iconography in the ancient world. The rules about who could seek an audience with the king, how they were to approach him, what gifts were appropriate, and how the reception was to proceed were all carefully specified, and their correct observance was a performance of the imperial hierarchy that the architecture of Persepolis was designed to express. The rules about Zoroastrianism and its relationship to the Achaemenid state reveal a religion that was simultaneously the private faith of the ruling dynasty and the theological framework within which imperial power was understood and justified without being imposed on the subject peoples of the empire. The Achaemenid kings understood themselves as acting under the authority and with the protection of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of the Zoroastrian tradition. The inscriptions that survive from Persepolis and other royal sites repeatedly invoke Ahura Mazda's blessing on the king and his works. But this theological framework was a framework for royal self-understanding and royal legitimation, rather than a framework for the religious governance of the empire's subject populations. The rules about the treatment of the sacred fire in Zoroastrianism were among the most specifically distinctive features of the religion, and among the most revealing of its specific understanding of the relationship between the divine and the material world. The sacred fire was not simply a symbol of the divine. It was understood as a manifestation of the divine light that was the fundamental nature of Ahura Mazda, and its maintenance through the continuous feeding and tending of fires in fire temples was a genuine act of worship that sustained the presence of the divine in the material world. The rules about the treatment of the sacred fire, about who could tend it, what could contaminate it, how it was to be maintained when not actively in use, and what the consequences were of allowing it to be extinguished, were as precisely specified as any ritual rules in any tradition we have examined. The rules about purity in Zoroastrianism were among the most extensive and most practically burdensome in any ancient religious tradition. The Zoroastrian understanding of the world was organized around a cosmic struggle between the forces of truth and order, Asher, and the forces of the lie and disorder, Druj, and the rules about ritual purity were rules about maintaining alignment with Asher and avoiding contamination by Druj, death, disease, menstruation, contact with corpses, and contact with specific categories of animals associated with Ahriman, the principle of evil, were all sources of ritual contamination that required specific purification procedures before the affected person could resume ordinary social and religious activities. The rules about the treatment of corpses in Zoroastrianism reveal the extreme consequences of the purity theology for one of the most universal of human social obligations. The Zoroastrian belief that the corpse was the most powerful source of ritual contamination available in the natural world meant that the burial practices of most other ancient cultures, which involved placing the corpse in the ground and allowing it to decay into the earth, were absolutely prohibited. Earth was sacred as one of the creations of Ahura Mazda and could not be contaminated by contact with a corpse. Water was sacred and could not be contaminated by contact with a corpse. Fire, the most sacred element, could not under any circumstances be used to destroy a corpse. The solution that Zoroastrian practice developed was the Tower of Silence, the Dakma, a circular stone structure built on a hilltop outside the inhabited area, on which the corpse was placed to be consumed by the vultures and the elements, with the bones collected after the flesh had been stripped away and deposited in a central pit within the structure. The rules about the treatment of the corpse on the Tower of Silence were specific and elaborate. Special functionaries, the Nasa Salars, who were themselves considered permanently contaminated by their work and who lived in a state of permanent ritual impurity, were responsible for managing the corpses and the bone collection. The rules about the contamination radius around the Tower of Silence, about who could approach it and how close, about the specific purification procedures required for anyone who came in contact with a corpse or with the people who handled corpses, were specified in considerable detail in the Zoroastrian religious texts. The rules about Nowruz, the Persian New Year celebration that fell at the spring equinox, reveal the specific form that the Zoroastrian understanding of the annual cycle of cosmic renewal took in the social and ceremonial life of the Persian Empire. Nowruz was not simply a calendrical marker. It was understood as the day on which Ahura Mazda had created the world, the day on which the cosmic forces of renewal and growth reached their maximum power, and the day on which the correct performance of specific ceremonies could align the coming year with the principles of order and abundance that Ahura Mazda represented. The rules about what was done at Nowruz, the specific foods prepared, the specific items displayed on the ceremonial table, the specific activities performed and avoided, the specific visits made and received, were elaborate and seriously observed. The Persian table setting for Nowruz, the Haft scene, with its 7 items beginning with the letter S in Persian, each symbolizing a specific aspect of the renewal that the new year represented, was a ceremonial object whose rules about composition and display were specified with the same precision as any other ritual object in any other tradition we have examined. The specific items, their symbolism, and the rules about their arrangement were the expression of a cosmological theory about the nature of renewal and abundance that the Zoroastrian tradition had developed over centuries. And Nowruz, together with its rules about correct observance, has survived the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, the conquest of Persia by Alexander, the Parthian and Sassanid dynasties, the Islamic conquest, and 1400 years of Islamic rule to remain one of the most widely observed holidays in the world today, celebrated by approximately 300 million people across Central Asia, the Middle East, and the Iranian diaspora. The rules that survive the empires that created them are the most powerful rules in history. They are the rules that have become so deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of the communities that observe them that no political transformation, no military conquest, no religious revolution has been able to dislodge them. Nowls is one of the most remarkable examples of this kind of survival. The holiday that the Achaemenid kings celebrated at Persepolis is still being celebrated in Tehran and Kabul and Dushanbe, and among Persian communities in Los Angeles and Toronto and Sydney, with rules that have changed in some ways and remained identical in others across 2,500 years of continuous observance. And here, at the end of the first part of tonight's journey, with the Persian spring equinox celebration still echoing in our imagination, we have arrived at the edge of the sleep that has been waiting patiently at the margins of the history. Greece and Persia have given us an extraordinary evening. The Athenian ekklesia and its rules about who could speak and who could be exiled and what could be tried and how. The Persian royal road and its rules about the messenger service that made the largest empire in the ancient world governable. The Eleusinian mysteries and their rules about silence that were so effectively maintained that we still do not know exactly what happened in that nocturnal ceremony. The Tower of Silence and its rules about the sacred elements that produced one of the most unusual funeral practices in the ancient world, and Nowruz and its rules about the spring table that have outlasted every empire and every political transformation that has tried to replace them. The rules were extraordinary. The people who made them were doing what human beings have always done, which was trying to understand the world they lived in, and to create the conditions under which life in that world was worth living. They mostly succeeded. Not perfectly, not always fairly, but well enough that their rules, in various transformed and transmitted and partially preserved forms, are still shaping the world we live in today. Rest now. The Athenian agora is quiet. The Persian royal road is still. The sacred fire burns low in the temple and will be tended again at dawn, and the vultures on the Tower of Silence have folded their wings for the night. But Greece and Persia have more to offer before we leave them entirely, because we have spent time in Athens and in the Persian court at Persepolis, and we have barely begun to exhaust what those civilizations produced in terms of extraordinary rules that reveal extraordinary thinking. Tonight we continue with dimensions of the Greek and Persian worlds that we have not yet examined, and then we turn to the civilization that connected them both and transformed them both, and produced something genuinely new from the combination, the Hellenistic world that Alexander the Great created when he took the military genius of Macedon and the philosophical inheritance of Athens and the administrative sophistication of Persia, and fused them into something that shaped the entire subsequent history of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent. But first, more Greece, because the Athens we examined in the first part of tonight's journey was a very specific Athens, the Athens of the classical period, the Athens of Pericles and Socrates and the Parthenon. The Greece that preceded it, the archaic Greece of the 7th and 6th centuries before our era, had its own set of extraordinary rules that were in many ways more interesting and more consequential than the rules of the classical period, because they were the rules in which the fundamental institutions of Greek civilization were being invented rather than operated. The rules of the Spartan system we have examined before, but Sparta deserves a brief return visit in the context of a broader examination of Greek rules, because the Spartan approach to governance was simultaneously the most extreme expression of the Greek tendency towards civic regulation and the most influential model of military organization that the ancient world produced. Every serious military power from Rome to the Prussian state of the 18th century studied and learned from the Spartan example, and the Spartan example was, at its core, An example of what happens when a community decides that the production of soldiers is the highest priority of civic life and designs every rule of its social organization to serve that priority. We have discussed the agoge, the Spartan education system, and the Sicilia, the communal mess where Spartan men spent their adult lives, and the extraordinary rules about marriage and childbirth, and the exposure of infants that were the entry points into the system. What we have not examined in detail is the Spartan rulebook about the Helots, the enslaved people of Laconia and Messenia, who provided the agricultural labour that freed the Spartan citizen class for full-time military preparation, and whose subjugation was both the economic foundation of the entire Spartan system and its most revealing moral dimension. The Helots were not slaves in the Athenian sense. They were not individuals bought and sold in a market. They were entire communities, the pre-conquest populations of the territories that Sparta had conquered, who had been reduced to a hereditary servile status that was attached to the land rather than to individual owners. A Helot farmed the land he had always farmed, but now he farmed it for a Spartan master who received a fixed portion of the agricultural output as tribute. He could not be sold away from his land. He could not be personally purchased or freed by an individual Spartan. His servile status was a matter between his community and the Spartan state, rather than a matter between him and an individual owner. The rules about the treatment of Helots revealed the specific anxiety that their status created for the Spartan ruling class. The Helots significantly outnumbered the Spartan citizens, perhaps by a ratio of 7-1 or more, and the possibility of Helot revolt was a permanent feature of the Spartan political imagination. The Cryptia, the secret police operation in which young Spartan men were sent out into the countryside at night, with instructions to kill any Helot they encountered who seemed dangerous or who was showing signs of leadership or organization, was not simply a brutal exercise in oppression. It was a specific institutional response to the genuine threat that a large, angry, and physically capable enslaved population posed to the small and constantly shrinking citizen class that depended on its labour. The rules about the annual declaration of war on the Helots by the Spartan state were one of the most remarkable pieces of institutional self-justification in the ancient world. Each year the ephors, the elected officials who served as a kind of constitutional check on the power of the Spartan kings, formally declared war on the Helot population. This declaration of war meant that killing a Helot was legally an act of war rather than a murder, which removed the religious pollution that killing a human being normally created, and which allowed the Cryptia operatives to kill without incurring the ritual contamination that blood guilt imposed. The Spartans had invented a legal fiction, the annual declaration of war on their own enslaved population, that allowed them to maintain an institutionalized program of selective killing while technically observing the religious rules about the impermissibility of murder. The rules of Solon, the Athenian lawgiver who reformed the Athenian legal and economic system around 594 before our era, are among the most consequential in the history of the ancient world, and deserve careful examination both for what they actually did and for what they tell us about the specific social crisis that generated them. Solon was appointed as a special mediator with extraordinary powers to reform the Athenian constitution in response to a situation that had reached the point of near civil war. The specific crisis was the caesatia, the burden of debt, under which large numbers of ordinary Athenians had borrowed against their land and their persons, and had lost both when they could not repay. The most extreme expression of the crisis was the existence of a class of Athenians, the hectomoroi, who were farming land that was no longer technically theirs, and paying a sixth of their agricultural output as a permanent obligation to the creditors who held their land, and the existence of debt slaves, Athenians who had been enslaved for failure to repay debts, and who were being worked or sold abroad. Solon's rules addressed this crisis through a combination of immediate relief and structural reform that was simultaneously the most politically radical and the most politically balanced response available. The Sisarcheia, the shaking off of burdens, cancelled all existing debts that were secured by the person or the land of the debtor. Athenians who had been enslaved for debt were freed. Land that had been pledged as security for loans was returned to its original holders. The mortgage stones, the horoi, that marked the debt obligations on Athenian land were removed. This was a genuine cancellation of private contracts on a massive scale, the kind of measure that creditors everywhere regarded as the most fundamental violation of property rights imaginable, and it was politically possible only because the alternative was civil war. The structural reforms that accompanied the debt cancellation were in some ways more consequential for the long-term development of Athenian democracy. Solon reorganized the Athenian citizenry into 4 property classes: the Pentakosiomedimnoi, the Hippes, the Zogatai, and the Tetes, with specific political rights and military obligations attached to each class. This was a reform that replaced the old aristocratic system in which birth determined political rights, with a new system in which property determined political rights, which was simultaneously more open than the aristocratic system it replaced, and more restrictive than the full democracy that would eventually succeed it. The Thetes, the lowest property class who owned no land at all, were now citizens with the right to participate in the assembly and the courts, but without the right to hold office. Their inclusion in the citizen body, even with limited rights, was a significant step toward the full democracy of the Periclean period. The rules that Solon specifically refused to make are as revealing as the rules he did make. He was offered the opportunity by his aristocratic supporters to make himself tyrant, to use the extraordinary powers he had been granted and the personal authority he had accumulated through the reform process to establish himself as the permanent ruler of Athens. He refused. He completed his reforms, submitted them to the scrutiny of the Athenian people, bound the Athenians by oath to observe them for 10 years, and then left Athens voluntarily, going on an extended journey to Egypt and elsewhere, so that his presence in Athens would not become a focal point for pressure to modify the reforms. The rules he made about his own conduct, the limits he placed on his own exercise of the extraordinary powers he had been given, were understood by subsequent Athenians as the defining expression of the wisdom and the self-restraint that made him one of the 7 sages of Greece. The rules about the oracle at Delphi were the rules that governed the most important political and religious institution in the entire Greek world, the institution that more than any other transcended the divisions between the individual city-states, and provided a kind of common reference point for Greek civilization as a whole. The oracle at Delphi, the Pythia, was a woman chosen from a local family of Delphi, who served as the medium through which the god Apollo communicated his answers to the questions of those who came to consult him. The rules about who could consult the oracle, how they were to prepare for the consultation, what form the consultation took, how the oracle's responses were to be interpreted, and what obligations the oracle's responses created for those who received them, were among the most precisely specified in the ancient world. The rules about the preparation for consulting the oracle required the questioner to undergo specific purification rituals, to pay specific fees, to sacrifice a specific animal, and to present the question in a specific form. The oracle was consulted only on specific days of the year, and the demand for consultations was so great that there was typically a long wait and a formal prioritization system that gave precedence to certain categories of questioners. The rules about who received priority, probulasis, the right to consult the oracle before others in the queue, were both a form of honor that the Delphic sanctuary conferred on favored individuals and states, and a source of political influence for the sanctuary, because the right to consult the oracle quickly in a crisis was genuinely valuable, and states competed for the right. The oracle's responses were famously ambiguous, which was itself a rule of sorts, a structural feature of the institution that had specific functions in the political economy of Delphic influence. An oracle that gave specific, unambiguous predictions about the future would be quickly discredited when the predictions failed to come true. An oracle whose responses required interpretation, whose meaning was only apparent in retrospect, could always be shown to have been correct in some reading of the ambiguous words, even when events turned out differently than the questioner had hoped or expected. The rule of ambiguity was not simply evasiveness. It was a sophisticated institutional design feature that allowed the oracle to maintain its credibility over centuries of consultations by building interpretive flexibility into every response. The rules of Pythagoras and the Pythagorean communities he established in southern Italy in the late 6th century before our era are among the most fascinating and most unusual in the ancient world because they combined mathematical research, philosophical speculation, religious practice, dietary regulation, and community governance into a single comprehensive rule system that governed every aspect of its members' lives. The Pythagoreans believed that number was the fundamental nature of reality, that the mathematical relationships that governed the behavior of the physical world were the deepest truth about that world, and that the study of those relationships was simultaneously scientific inquiry and spiritual practice. The specific rules of the Pythagorean community combined the cosmic with the mundane in ways that are genuinely strange even by the standards of the ancient world. Members of the community were prohibited from eating beans, they were prohibited from picking up objects that had fallen, they were prohibited from eating the hearts of animals, they were prohibited from urinating toward the sun, they were prohibited from leaving the impression of their bodies in their bedding, which meant smoothing the bed coverings when they arose in the morning, and they were required to observe strict silence for the first years of their membership in the community, listening to Pythagorean teaching without being permitted to ask questions or engage in discussion. The prohibition on eating beans is the most famous of the Pythagorean rules, and the most discussed, because no ancient source gives a fully satisfactory explanation of it. Various ancient commentators explained it by reference to the role of beans in civic voting procedures, since the Greeks used beans as ballots, and the prohibition might be interpreted as a rule about abstaining from civic politics. Others connected it to a belief about the transmigration of souls, and the specific vehicle through which souls passed from one life to another. Still others explained it as a simple dietary rule, whose health benefits the Pythagoreans had identified through empirical observation. The fact that no single explanation was universally accepted even in antiquity suggests that the rule may have originated in a specific theological context that was already obscure by the time the classical commentators were trying to explain it. The rules about silence in the Pythagorean community reflect a specific theory of education that understood listening before speaking as the fundamental prerequisite for genuine understanding. A student who had not yet achieved the level of understanding that entitled him to engage in philosophical discussion was a student who needed to develop that understanding through concentrated attention to the teaching rather than through the premature articulation of his own incompletely formed ideas. The specific period of silence, which ancient sources report as lasting anywhere from 2 to 5 years, was not a punishment or a test of obedience. It was a specific pedagogical method organized around the belief that the capacity for genuine philosophical conversation had to be developed before it could be exercised. The Pythagorean discovery of the mathematical relationship between musical intervals and numerical ratios, the discovery that the harmonious intervals of the musical scale corresponded to simple ratios of string lengths, was one of the most consequential discoveries in the history of science because it established for the first time a mathematical relationship between a qualitative human experience, the beauty of harmonic music, and a quantitative physical fact, the ratio of string lengths. The rules that Pythagoras developed about the mathematical study of music were the foundation of the entire subsequent Western tradition of music theory, and the specific discovery that consonant musical intervals corresponded to simple ratios was understood by the Pythagoreans as evidence that the entire universe was organized according to mathematical principles that human beings could discover and understand through disciplined inquiry. The rules of Heraclitus of Ephesus, who was working in the late 6th and early 5th centuries before our era, are not rules in the institutional sense of the other rules we have been examining. They are rules in the philosophical sense, principles that Heraclitus believed governed the fundamental structure of reality, and they are worth examining because they reveal a dimension of archaic Greek thinking about the nature of the world that is genuinely extraordinary and that had consequences for every subsequent philosophical tradition in the Western world. Heraclitus believed that reality was fundamentally characterized by constant change and conflict, that the apparent stability of things was a surface phenomenon concealing a deeper reality of continuous transformation, that the logos, the rational principle that governed all things, expressed itself through the tension between opposites rather than through their resolution, and that most human beings were unable to perceive this fundamental reality because they were captured by the surface appearances of a world that seemed stable, but was in fact in constant flux. The specific rule that Heraclitus is most famous for, the statement that you cannot step into the same river twice, is a rule about the nature of identity through change that has philosophical implications that extend far beyond the specific example of the river. If the river is a different river because its waters have changed, then the identity of the river is not located in its material composition, but in its pattern, its form. It's the ongoing process of being a river. And if that is true of rivers, it may be true of everything, including the human beings who try to step into them. Now let us turn to Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic world he created, because no survey of the rules of the ancient Greek and Persian world can be complete without examining what happened when those two traditions collided in the conquests of the 330s and 20s before our era, and what kind of new rules the collision produced. Alexander III of Macedon, who became king of Macedon at the age of 20 after the assassination of his father Philip II, and who within 13 years had conquered the Persian Empire, Egypt, the territories of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, and had advanced into the Indian subcontinent as far as the Punjab before his army refused to go further, was one of the most consequential human beings who ever lived in terms of the specific changes his actions produced in the world he passed through. The rules that Alexander applied to the management of his conquests were not simply the military rules of the Macedonian tradition. They were a developing synthesis of Macedonian, Greek, Persian, and Egyptian administrative practices that Alexander modified as he went, learning from the administrative sophistication of the Persian Empire he was conquering, and incorporating its methods into his own governance in ways that Macedonian and Greek tradition had not previously included. The specific decision to retain Persian administrative structures and personnel in the territories he conquered, to appoint Persian satraps alongside Macedonian military commanders, rather than replacing Persian administrators wholesale with Macedonian ones, reflected the same pragmatic wisdom about the management of large diverse territories that the Achaemenid kings had developed over 2 centuries of imperial experience. The rules about the proskynesis, the prostration before the king that was standard practice in the Persian court, became one of the most contentious issues of Alexander's rule, because it represented a direct collision between Persian imperial protocol and Macedonian aristocratic custom. In the Persian system, proskynesis was performed before the king by all subjects, regardless of their rank or their relationship to the king, as an expression of the fundamental distinction between the king who was of divine quality and the ordinary human beings who served him. In the Macedonian tradition, proskynesis was a gesture performed before the gods rather than before human beings, and to perform it before a human king was to make a claim about that king's divine status, that was theologically inappropriate and politically offensive to the Macedonian nobility, who understood themselves as the king's companions rather than his subjects. Alexander's attempt to introduce the proskynesis at his court, whether as a genuine expression of his developing sense of his own divine status, or as a pragmatic measure to unify Persian and Macedonian court practice, produced one of the most dramatic confrontations of his reign. The philosopher Callisthenes, who had accompanied the campaign as its official historian, publicly refused to perform the proskynesis, and delivered a philosophical argument against the practice that reflected the standard Greek view that such gestures were appropriate only for gods. Callisthenes was subsequently executed for his alleged involvement in a conspiracy against Alexander, but the specific confrontation over the proskynesis illuminated the fundamental tension between the Macedonian and Greek traditions of the relationship between leaders and their followers, and the Persian tradition of the relationship between kings and their subjects that Alexander's rule was trying to bridge. The rules of the Hellenistic kingdoms that succeeded Alexander's empire after his death in 323 before our era, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedon, were the rules that governed the world in which the Mediterranean civilizations of the last 3 centuries before our era developed. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt is particularly interesting for its rules, because it was the most successful of the successor kingdoms in maintaining itself for the longest period, from the death of Alexander to the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 before our era, nearly 300 years. And because the rules it developed for governing Egypt combined the pharaonic tradition of Egyptian governance with the Macedonian Greek tradition of its rulers in ways that produced something genuinely hybrid and genuinely interesting. The rules of the Ptolemaic monarchy required the Ptolemaic kings and queens to perform their role in 2 distinct registers simultaneously. In their interactions with the Greek-speaking population of Alexandria and the other Greek cities of Egypt, they were Macedonian Greek monarchs operating within the cultural expectations of the Hellenistic world. In their interactions with the Egyptian population and the Egyptian priesthood, they were pharaohs operating within the cultural expectations of the pharaonic tradition, depicted in Egyptian style on the walls of Egyptian temples, performing the Egyptian royal rituals, speaking of themselves in the language of the divine Egyptian kingship that had not changed in its fundamental terms since the Old Kingdom. The rules about how each persona was to be maintained, how transitions were made between contexts, and what happened when the 2 cultural systems made incompatible demands on the royal household, were the practical challenges of governing a population that was itself divided between Greek and Egyptian cultural traditions. The most famous and most consequential product of the Hellenistic synthesis was the Library of Alexandria, which was not simply a library in the modern sense, but an institution dedicated to the collection, preservation, editing, and scholarly analysis of every text in the known world, funded by the Ptolemaic state, and staffed by the most accomplished scholars of the age. The rules about what the library was to collect were ambitious beyond any previous institutional ambition in the history of knowledge. The Ptolemaic kings reportedly instructed their agents to confiscate books from every ship that docked at Alexandria, have copies made, and return the copies while keeping the originals. They reportedly wrote to every king and ruler in the known world, asking for texts to be sent to Alexandria for copying. The specific rules about how the collection was organized, how texts were edited and corrected, how scholars had access to the collection, and how the scholarship produced from the collection was to be disseminated, were the rules that made the library the intellectual center of the Hellenistic world for several centuries. The rules of Hellenistic philosophy reflect the specific psychological and social conditions of the post-Alexandrian world, in which the individual had been displaced from the small, intensely communal life of the classical city-state into a vast cosmopolitan world where the familiar structures of civic identity no longer provided the same anchoring. The Stoic, Epicurean, and Skeptic philosophical schools that dominated the Hellenistic period were each in their different ways responses to the specific challenge of how to live well in a world that was too large, too diverse, and too uncertain to be governed by the rules of the classical city-state tradition. The rules of Stoicism were rules about the management of the relationship between what is in your control and what is not in your control, which the Stoics identified as the fundamental practical distinction around which a good human life had to be organized. The only thing genuinely in your control is your own judgment, your own rational response to the circumstances that the world presents to you. Everything else, your health, your wealth, your reputation, the behavior of other people, the events of the external world, is not genuinely in your control and should not be allowed to disturb the rational equanimity that is the Stoic ideal of human excellence. The rules that derived from this fundamental distinction were rules about what to value, what to pursue, what to accept, and what to resist in the ordinary circumstances of human life. The rules of Epicureanism were organized around a different fundamental distinction, the distinction between the pleasures and pains that constituted the actual content of human experience, and the false beliefs about what produces pleasure and what produces pain that most people substituted for accurate perception. Epicurus taught that the highest pleasure was ataraxia, the absence of mental disturbance, and aponia, the absence of physical pain, and that these were achievable by any person who correctly understood what actually produced them and organized their life accordingly. The rules of Epicurean life were rules about the cultivation of friendship, the simplification of desire, the withdrawal from political life with its anxieties and conflicts, and the philosophical study that produced the understanding of the world necessary to free the mind from the fears, particularly the fear of death and the fear of divine punishment, that prevented most people from achieving the tranquility that was the actual goal of human existence. The rules of the Cynics were the most radical and the most performatively provocative of the Hellenistic philosophical schools, and they were rules that were enacted rather than argued, performed in public space rather than taught in schools. The Cynics believed that the conventions of civilized society, the rules about dress and decency and property and political participation and social hierarchy and the performance of social roles were not the expression of genuine human values, but their perversion, the accumulated weight of social convention that prevented human beings from living according to nature and according to reason. The Cynic response was to violate the conventions as publicly as possible, to live without property, to dress in rags or to go naked, to perform in public the bodily functions that social convention required to be performed in private, to speak with a directness and an offensiveness that violated every rule of social discourse, and thereby to demonstrate both that the conventions were conventions rather than necessities, and that their violation did not produce the social catastrophe that their defenders claimed it would. Diogenes of Sinope, the most famous of the Cynics, reportedly lived in a large ceramic storage jar rather than a house, begged for his food, masturbated in public on the grounds that he was simply performing a natural function that social convention had unnecessarily hidden, and told Alexander the Great, who visited him and offered him any favour, that he wanted only for Alexander to stop blocking the sunlight. The rules of Diogenes were anti-rules, rules about the violation of rules, and their purpose was to make visible the arbitrary character of the conventions that most people treated as natural and necessary. Whether you find them admirable or repellent, or both simultaneously, depends on what you think the purpose of social conventions is, and whether you share the Cynic's conviction that most of them are corruptions rather than expressions of genuine human nature. And now, with the philosophers and the oracle, and the library and the Hellenistic synthesis, and the Cynics in their jars, and the Stoics practicing their equanimity, and the Pythagoreans refusing their beans, we have arrived at the place where the night and the history have brought us as far as they can together for this evening. The Athenian agora is quiet. The Persian royal road has carried its last message of the night. The Library of Alexandria has closed its reading rooms, and the scholars have gone to their beds with their arguments still unresolved. The oracle at Delphi has delivered its last ambiguous pronouncement of the day, and the questioners are still working out what it might mean. All of them rest now. The rule makers and the rule breakers and the rule interpreters, the citizens who voted in the ekklesia, and the helots who were annually declared enemies of the state, the heterae who attended the symposia, and the citizen women who managed the households, the Persian satraps who governed their diverse provinces, and the Zoroastrian priests who tended the sacred fire, the Pythagoreans who would not eat beans, and the cynics who would do anything in public. All of them were trying in their different ways to understand the world they lived in, and to create the conditions under which life in that world was worth living. The rules were extraordinary. The people who made them and lived under them and argued about them and violated them and enforced them were human, completely, recognizably, magnificently, and sometimes catastrophically human, with the same needs and the same fears and the same hopes and the same tendency to construct elaborate justifications for the things they wanted to do anyway that has characterized our species from the beginning. Sleep well. The ancient world is resting now. The arguments about justice and virtue and the good life will continue in the morning. But for tonight, finally, the questions can rest alongside the questioners, but the night has more to offer. Because we have spent time in Athens and Sparta and Persia and the Hellenistic world, and we have not yet visited the civilization that absorbed all of these traditions and transformed them into something that shaped the entire subsequent history of the Western world in ways that are still visible in every legal system, every political institution, every architectural tradition, every religious calendar, and every philosophical framework that the modern world has inherited. We have not yet visited Rome. Rome is not simply another ancient civilization to add to the list. Rome is the civilization through which virtually everything we have examined tonight and in our previous journeys through the ancient world was transmitted to the modern one. The Roman legal tradition is the foundation of every legal system in continental Europe, and every legal system derived from continental European law. The Roman administrative tradition is the model for every large-scale bureaucratic organization that the Western world has developed. The Roman engineering tradition produced the roads and aqueducts and buildings that were still functioning centuries after Rome itself had fallen. And the Roman rules about how a civilization should organize itself, govern itself, entertain itself, pray, eat, fight, love, die, and remember its dead were the rules that the entire subsequent Western tradition learned from, argued with, rejected, and returned to in every generation from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the present day. If you wake up as a Roman citizen in the city of Rome in the year 100 of our era, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan, you are living in a city of perhaps 1 million people, the largest city in the Western world, in the capital of an empire that stretches from Scotland in the north to the Sahara in the south, from Portugal in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. The city you live in is a city of extraordinary contrasts. The marble monuments of the imperial forums, the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, the great temples on the Capitoline Hill, the baths, the aqueducts, the triumphal arches, express a wealth and a power and a cultural ambition that are genuinely staggering in their scale. And alongside these monuments, in the insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings that housed the vast majority of Rome's population, are the living conditions that produced the other Rome, the Rome of crowded rooms and inadequate sanitation and fire risk, and the constant press of hundreds of thousands of people in a space that was never designed to hold them. The rules that governed life in the insula are among the most practically revealing in the entire corpus of Roman social regulation, because they addressed the specific challenges of urban density in ways that were simultaneously rational and inadequate. The rules about the maximum height of insulae were repeatedly specified and repeatedly violated. Augustus limited them to 70 Roman feet. Trajan reduced the limit to 60 feet. The limit was consistently exceeded because the economic incentives to build higher were stronger than the enforcement mechanisms available to prevent it. The rules about fire prevention in insula specified that certain materials could not be used in construction, that certain activities involving fire could not be conducted in upper floors, and that building owners were responsible for the fire safety of their properties. These rules were in place because the risk of fire in a densely packed wooden and brick city with inadequate water pressure was real and catastrophic, as the Great Fire of Rome in 64 of our era demonstrated when it destroyed large portions of the city over several days. The rules about the Roman street system reveal a city that was simultaneously brilliantly engineered at the imperial level and chaotically organized at the neighborhood level. The great roads that connected Rome to every corner of the empire, the Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, the Via Aurelia, and dozens of others, were engineering achievements of extraordinary precision and durability, built on foundations of gravel and stone that could support heavy military and commercial traffic, and that were maintained by a system of road curators funded by the imperial treasury. The rules about the construction and maintenance of the great roads were specified in considerable detail, with specific requirements for foundation depth, surface material, drainage, and the provision of milestones at regular intervals that allowed travelers to calculate their distance from Rome with accuracy. The streets of Rome itself were a different matter. The rules about street use in the city of Rome were a fascinating combination of practical necessity and social hierarchy. A rule dating from the time of Julius Caesar prohibited wheeled traffic from the streets of Rome during the daylight hours, on the grounds that the streets were too narrow and too crowded with pedestrians for carts and wagons to move without creating impossible congestion. The consequence was that the commercial deliveries that supplied a city of 1 million people with food and goods had to be made at night, which meant that the city experienced a nightly transformation from the pedestrian chaos of the day to the rumbling cacophony of hundreds of carts and wagons moving through the streets in darkness. The satirist Juvenal complained that it was impossible to sleep in Rome because of the noise of nighttime delivery traffic, which tells you something both about the practical effectiveness of the wheeled traffic rule and about the quality of life in a Roman insula. The rules of Roman law are among the most consequential in human history, and they deserve extended treatment that goes beyond the specific rules of daily life to examine the philosophical and institutional framework within which those rules were developed and applied. Roman law at its height, the classical law of the 1st through 3rd centuries of our era, developed by the great jurists whose writings were later compiled in Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, was a legal system of extraordinary sophistication that developed specific concepts, specific analytical tools, and specific institutional mechanisms for the resolution of disputes that were genuinely new in the history of human legal thought, and that are still the foundation of modern civil law systems. The distinction between ius civila, the civil law that applied to Roman citizens, ius gentium, the law of peoples that applied to transactions between Romans and non-Romans, and that was understood as reflecting the common principles of law recognized by all civilized peoples, and ius naturale, the natural law that was understood as reflecting the rational order of the universe itself, was one of the most important analytical distinctions in the entire history of legal thought. The ius naturale concept in particular was the foundation of the natural law tradition that runs from the Roman jurists through the medieval scholastics, through the early modern natural rights theorists, to the modern concept of universal human rights. The idea that there are legal principles that derive not from the positive enactments of any particular political community, but from the rational nature of human beings as such, principles that are therefore binding on all human communities, and that positive law can recognize or violate but cannot create or destroy, is a Roman idea in its specific legal formulation, whatever its deeper philosophical roots in Greek thought. The rules about the Roman contract were developed with a precision and a systematic character that reflected centuries of practical experience with the challenges of organizing commercial life in a large, complex economy. Roman law recognized several specific categories of contract each with its own rules about formation, performance, and remedy. The stipulatia, a formal verbal contract created by the exchange of a question and an answer in specific form, was enforceable because the form itself created the obligation regardless of the underlying transaction it documented. The emptio vendicio, the contract of sale, was enforceable because the agreement on price and subject matter created mutual obligations of delivery and payment that the legal system would enforce. The locatio conductio, the contract of hire, covered the rental of things, the hire of services, and the letting of construction contracts under a single analytical framework that identified the common structure underlying these different transactions. The rules about Roman property law reflect a level of analytical sophistication about the nature of ownership and the variety of property rights that had no precedent in the ancient world and that required several centuries of juristic development to reach their classical form. The distinction between ownership, dominium, and possession, possessio, was not simply a practical distinction between who had legal title and who had physical control. It was an analytical distinction about the nature of the rights involved, with ownership being an absolute right recognized by the civil law, and possession being a protected fact of physical control that the law recognized and protected even without a determination of underlying ownership. The rules about how ownership was acquired, how it was transferred, how it was lost, and what remedies were available to the owner whose property was wrongfully taken or interfered with, were developed in case-by-case analysis by the Roman jurists into a systematic body of rules that covered every category of property and every category of interference with property right. The rules about the Roman family and the patria potestas, the power of the father, are among the most revealing of Roman social organization, and among the most startling to modern readers who encounter them without context. The pater familias, the male head of the Roman family, had in early Roman law a power over the members of his family that was theoretically without limit. He could sell his children into slavery. He could kill a child at birth by the same process of exposure that the Spartans used. He could inflict any punishment on his adult children that he considered appropriate, and his power continued over his male children until his death, regardless of how old those children became. An adult son, who was himself a senator, a general, a magistrate, was in theory under the absolute power of his elderly father as long as that father lived. The rules about the patria potestas tell you something important about the Roman understanding of the family as a legal unit, and about the specific way in which Roman law approached the question of legal personality. In the Roman system, the capacity to hold property and to enter into legally enforceable obligations, the capacity that modern law calls legal personality, was not simply a consequence of being a free adult human being. It was a consequence of being the head of a household, the pater familias. A son in his father's power, however old and however distinguished, did not have full legal personality in this sense. He could not own property in his own right. He could not enter into contracts in his own name that created obligations binding on himself rather than his father. The son's legal existence was subsumed in the father's for as long as the patria potestas lasted. In practice, the harshest aspects of the patria potestas were moderated by custom, by social pressure, and by the specific legal rules that developed over time to limit the father's power in specific contexts. The power to kill children, both the power of exposure at birth and the power to execute adult children for serious crimes, was moderated in practice by the institution of the family council, a group of senior male relatives who were convened to hear the case and advise the paterfamilias before he exercised the power of life and death over a family member. The advice of the family council was not legally binding, but the social pressure to follow it was strong, and the paterfamilias who executed an adult son without convening the family council was exposing himself to the kind of social censure that could damage his reputation and his family's standing in ways that were practically significant, even if they were not legally enforceable. The rules about the Roman senatorial class and its relationship to commerce and manual labour are among the most revealing of how Roman aristocratic values worked in practice. The senatorial order was prohibited by law from engaging in trade, from owning commercial ships above a certain size, and from directly participating in the commercial activities that generated the large fortunes that the most successful Roman businessmen accumulated. These prohibitions were not simply expressions of aristocratic disdain for commerce. They were part of a specific theory about the incompatibility of the political role of the senator and the economic interests of the merchant, a theory that held that a senator whose wealth depended on commercial success had interests that could conflict with his political obligations in ways that would compromise his independence of judgment. The practical consequence of these prohibitions was that wealthy senators who wanted to participate in commercial activity did so through agents, through freedmen who conducted business on their behalf and whose commercial success enriched the senator without technically violating the prohibition on direct commercial participation. The rules about the relationship between senators and their freedmen agents were a practical accommodation between the aristocratic ideology that prohibited commerce and the economic reality that the senatorial order needed to find ways to grow its wealth in a commercial economy. The freedman who became wealthy through commercial activity, conducted on behalf of his patron, was a legal person with his own property and his own legal rights, but whose practical economic existence was deeply entangled with his patron's interests in ways that the formal rules about commercial prohibition did not prevent. The rules about the Roman games, the ludi, are among the most revealing and most disturbing in the entire corpus of Roman social regulation, because they reveal a civilization that was simultaneously capable of extraordinary philosophical sophistication and capable of organizing the systematic killing of human beings as a form of public entertainment with an enthusiasm and a scale that have no parallel in the ancient world. The gladiatorial games, the beast hunts, the naval battles staged in flooded arenas, and the public executions of criminals by exposure to animals or by forcing them to fight each other, or trained gladiators, were not aberrations in Roman culture. They were central institutions of Roman civic life, funded by the state and by wealthy individuals seeking popular support. Attended by virtually the entire Roman population, including women and children, and the most philosophically sophisticated members of the elite, and governed by elaborate rules that specified every aspect of their organization and conduct. The rules about the gladiatorial games were specific and seriously observed. Gladiators were professional fighters trained in specific fighting styles, each associated with specific weapons and armor and specific tactical approaches. The murmillo fought with a large shield and a short sword, and wore a helmet with a fish crest. The retiarius fought with a net and a trident, and wore minimal armor. The secutor was designed specifically to fight the retiarius, and wore a smooth helmet to prevent the net from catching. The thraex fought with a curved short sword and a small shield. Each fighting style had its own training tradition, its own equipment specifications, and its own rules about how fights in that style were to be conducted. The rules about what happened at the end of a gladiatorial fight, when one fighter was wounded or exhausted and sought mercy from the crowd, are among the most famous and most misrepresented aspects of Roman gladiatorial culture. The popular image of the thumbs up and thumbs down gesture determining the fate of the fallen gladiator is almost certainly inaccurate as a description of the specific gesture used, though the general principle that the crowd indicated whether the defeated fighter should be spared or killed was real. The rules about who had the final decision in this matter, whether it was the editor who was sponsoring the games, the crowd whose entertainment value the decision was supposed to serve, or the emperor when he was present, were not entirely fixed and seem to have varied in practice. What the rules about mercy in the gladiatorial arena reveal is a specific Roman theory about the relationship between the display of courage in extremis and the right to continued existence. A gladiator who had fought well and lost was entitled to seek mercy because his performance had demonstrated the quality that the games were supposed to celebrate. A gladiator who had fought badly, who had shown fear, or had failed to engage his opponent with full commitment, was not entitled to mercy because his performance had failed to deliver what the games were there to provide. The rules about mercy were therefore rules about the evaluation of performance according to a specific set of values about courage, skill, and the proper conduct of violent conflict. The rules about the Vestal Virgins are among the most extraordinary in the entire Roman religious system and reveal the specific form that Roman civic religion took at its most extreme and most carefully specified. The Vestals were a college of 6 women who served as the priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth and the sacred fire, and whose religious function was to maintain the sacred fire that burned in the temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum, and that was understood as the hearth fire of Rome itself, the divine fire whose continuous burning was a condition for the continued existence and prosperity of the city. The rules governing the selection, the training, the conduct, and the privileges of the Vestal Virgins were specified in extraordinary detail, and were among the most seriously observed in the entire Roman religious system. Vestals were selected between the ages of 6 and 10 from the daughters of free-born Roman citizens of good standing. The selection was made by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, from among the candidates who met the specified qualifications, which included freedom from physical defect, the absence of any speech impediment, and the requirement that both parents be living at the time of selection. The Vestal served for 30 years, the first 10 years learning her duties, the second 10 years performing them, and the third 10 years teaching them to the new initiates who would succeed her. The specific duties of the Vestals were connected to the maintenance of the sacred fire and to the performance of several annual rituals that were essential to the religious calendar of the Roman state. The rules about the sacred fire specified that it was never to be allowed to go out. If it did go out, which happened on several recorded occasions, it was a religious catastrophe requiring specific expiatory rituals and investigation into what failure of Vestal conduct had caused the divine displeasure that had expressed itself in the extinction of the fire. The fire could only be relighted by specific means, using friction to produce fire from a piece of sacred wood rather than from any other source, and the relighting ritual itself was governed by specific rules about who could perform it and how. The specific rule that gave the Vestal Virgins their name, and that governed the most serious obligation of their service, was the rule of chastity. A Vestal who broke her vow of chastity was guilty of an offence that was understood not as a personal moral failing, but as a religious pollution of the sacred fire and of the Roman state religion that threatened the entire community. The punishment for a Vestal who broke her vow of chastity was burial alive in a small underground chamber, the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked, with a small supply of food and a lamp. The punishment was not technically an execution, because the religious rules prohibited the direct killing of a Vestal, but its practical effect was the same. The Vestal was lowered into the chamber and sealed in to die. The specific cases of Vestals who were punished for breaking their vows, which ancient sources record with considerable detail, reveal a process that combined genuine legal investigation with the specific anxieties of a religious system that believed the chastity of the Vestals was directly connected to the fortunes of the Roman state. When Rome suffered military defeats, famines, plagues, or other serious setbacks, one of the explanations that the religious system provided was the possibility that a Vestal had broken her vow without having been detected, and that the divine displeasure resulting from this pollution was expressing itself in the calamities that Rome was experiencing. The investigation of alleged Vestal unchastity was therefore not simply a legal inquiry into a personal moral failing. It was a theological investigation into the possible source of divine displeasure with Rome, conducted under conditions of intense public interest and political pressure. The rules about the Roman triumph, the greatest honour that the Roman state could bestow on a victorious general, reveal the specific relationship between military achievement, religious obligation, and political status that organised the Roman aristocratic value system. A triumph was a ceremonial procession through the streets of Rome in which the victorious general, dressed in the specific costume of Jupiter, the king of the gods, rode in a 4-horse chariot from the Campus Martius through the Forum to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, preceded by his soldiers and by the prisoners and the spoils of his victory. The specific rules that determined whether a general was entitled to a triumph were specified and were taken seriously as constraints on who could claim the honour. The rules required that the general had won a decisive victory in a just war against a foreign enemy, that at least 5,000 enemy soldiers had been killed in the engagement, that the war had been completed and the province pacified so that the general could leave his command, and that the general had been acting under his own authority as a holder of imperium rather than as a subordinate of another commander. These rules were not simply administrative criteria, they were expressions of a theory about what a triumph was for, what kind of achievement it was supposed to celebrate, and what the religious significance of the ceremony required. The triumph was not simply a victory parade. It was a religious ceremony in which the general was temporarily identified with Jupiter, which was understood as a real and theologically significant identification that the rules were designed to ensure was appropriate to the specific quality of achievement it celebrated. The rules about Roman slavery were as central to the economic and social structure of the Roman world as Athenian slavery was to the Athenian world, but the Roman slave system had specific features that distinguished it from the Athenian, and that had specific consequences for the texture of Roman social life. The scale of Roman slavery was even larger than the Athenian, with estimates for the slave population of Italy in the late Republic and early Empire ranging from 1/4 to 1/3 of the total population. The sources of slaves were diverse, including military conquest, the slave trade, children born to slave mothers, and debt slavery in certain periods and places, and the range of roles that slaves occupied in the Roman economy was correspondingly diverse. The rules about the manumission of slaves in the Roman system were considerably more formal and more legally consequential than in most other ancient slave systems. A Roman slave who was formally manumitted by his master became a Roman freedman with a specific legal status that was between slave and full citizen. He acquired the right to own property, to enter into contracts, to appear in court, and to participate in certain aspects of Roman civic life. He retained a specific relationship of obligation to his former master, who became his patron, and who retained certain rights over his labour and his property that distinguished the freedman's status from that of a freeborn citizen. But his children born after his manumission were full Roman citizens with no legal mark of the servile origin of their father. The rules about the freedman's relationship to his patron were specified in considerable detail by Roman law and were a significant feature of the Roman social landscape. The freedman owed his patron-specific services operae, whose number and character were negotiated at the time of manumission, and which were legally enforceable. He owed his patron respect obsequium, which was a broader obligation of deference and consideration that went beyond the specific operae to cover the general conduct of the relationship, and he could not take legal action against his patron in ways that would dishonour him, which meant that the patron retained a practical immunity from legal challenge by his freedman client that preserved the hierarchy of the original relationship even after the legal bond of slavery had been formally dissolved. The rules about Roman religion in the imperial period reveal a system that was simultaneously extraordinarily tolerant in its accommodation of the diverse religious traditions of the empire and absolutely insistent on specific ritual obligations that expressed loyalty to the Roman state through the medium of religious observance. The Roman imperial cult, the worship of the emperor as a divine being, or as a being who would become divine after death, was not primarily a matter of genuine theological belief. It was primarily a political ritual through which the diverse populations of the empire expressed their incorporation into the Roman political order. Sacrificing to the genius of the emperor, the divine spirit that animated the imperial office, was an act of political loyalty performed in religious form, and the refusal to perform this ritual was therefore understood not as a matter of personal religious belief, but as a political act of disloyalty to the Roman state. This is why the Christian refusal to sacrifice to the emperor was so politically inflammatory in the Roman context, and why it produced the periodic persecutions that the early Christian community experienced. The Christians were not being persecuted for believing the wrong things. The Roman system was, in general, indifferent to what people privately believed about the divine. They were being persecuted for refusing to perform a specific public ritual that was understood as an expression of political loyalty, and their refusal was interpreted as a political statement about the authority of the Roman state that the Roman state could not tolerate in the same way that it tolerated the private religious practices of Jews, or Egyptians, or Syrians, or any other subject, people who performed the required public rituals while maintaining their own private religious traditions. The rules about the Roman military are the rules that made everything else about Roman civilization possible, because the Roman Empire was ultimately the product of military conquest and was maintained by the continuous threat and occasional exercise of military force. The rules about the Roman legion, about the training, the organization, the discipline, the equipment and the tactical deployment of the primary military unit of the Roman army, were developed over several centuries of practical experience into a system of extraordinary effectiveness that defeated every organized military force it encountered for several centuries. The rules about Roman military discipline were severe and consistently applied in ways that distinguished the Roman military from most ancient armies. The decimation, the practice of executing 1 in 10 soldiers of a unit that had failed in battle or shown cowardice, is the most famous and most extreme expression of Roman military discipline, but it was a rare measure reserved for extraordinary failures rather than a routine punishment. The more ordinary rules of Roman military discipline covered everything from the specific penalties for sleeping on sentry duty, which was death, to the specific punishments for theft from fellow soldiers, to the rules about the distribution of booty after a battle, to the rules about the treatment of prisoners of war. The rules about the Roman camp reveal a military culture that understood the organization of physical space as a military asset. Every Roman army on campaign built a fortified camp each night according to a specific plan that never varied regardless of the terrain or the specific circumstances of the campaign. The gate was always in the same position relative to the commander's tent. The tents of different units were always arranged in the same relative positions. The streets of the camp always ran in the same directions, and intersected at the same angles. The rules about the camp layout were not simply rules about organization and efficiency, though they served those purposes too. They were rules about the management of fear and disorientation in an army on campaign, about providing soldiers with a familiar and predictable environment that reduced the psychological stress of campaigning in unknown territory, and that allowed any soldier to navigate the camp in darkness or emergency without confusion. The rules about the Roman aqueduct system reveal the specific way in which Roman engineering was simultaneously a practical achievement and an expression of the Roman theory of civic life. Rome at its height was served by 11 major aqueducts, delivering an estimated 1 million cubic meters of water per day to a city of 1 million people, a per capita water supply that exceeded that of most modern cities. The rules about the aqueduct system covered the construction of the structures, the maintenance of the water quality through the entire length of the conduit, the distribution of the water through the city, and the access of different categories of users to the water supply. The rules about who could access the aqueduct water were organized according to a hierarchy of uses and users. The public fountains from which ordinary Romans obtained their water supply had priority. The public baths that were one of the most important civic institutions of Roman urban life had priority after the fountains. Private connections to the aqueduct system were available to wealthy individuals who paid for the privilege and who received a specific quantity of water proportional to the size of the pipe connecting their property to the main conduit. The rules about illegal tapping of the aqueduct, which was a significant problem given the enormous economic value of private access to the water supply, were specified and enforced by specific officials whose responsibility was the supervision of the aqueduct system and the prosecution of unauthorized access. The rules about the Roman baths, the thermae, are among the most revealing in the entire corpus of Roman social regulation, because the thermae were simultaneously the most democratic and the most egalitarian institution of Roman civic life, and the most elaborately stratified. The great imperial baths of Rome, the baths of Caracalla, and the baths of Diocletian, were public institutions open to virtually anyone who could pay the small entrance fee, which was reduced or waived on imperial feast days. They contained not just bathing facilities, but libraries, exercise rooms, gardens, shops, and social spaces that made them the primary public social institution of the Roman city. A Roman citizen who had access to the thermae had access to a level of physical comfort, of public amenity, of social interaction with fellow citizens of every economic level, that was simply unavailable to the population of most pre-modern cities at any subsequent point until the development of modern municipal infrastructure. And now, with Rome and its aqueducts and its gladiators and its vestals and its triumph ceremonies and its slave system and its extraordinary legal tradition behind us, we arrive at the final moment of tonight's journey. We have travelled from Athens to Sparta to Persia to the Hellenistic world to Rome, passing through the oracle at Delphi and the Tower of Silence and the Pythagorean prohibition on beans and the Stoic management of the dichotomy of control and the Roman sacred fire and the rules about who could receive mercy in the gladiatorial arena and who could be buried alive for breaking a vow. All of these rules, from the most philosophically elevated to the most practically mundane, from the most humane to the most terrible, were expressions of the same fundamental project. The project of creating the conditions under which human beings can live together in communities large enough to accomplish what no individual can accomplish alone, in ways that most of the people living in those communities find meaningful enough to justify the constraints that community life always imposes. The rules were never perfect. No rules anywhere in any civilization we have examined have been perfect. The rules were always partial expressions of the values of the communities that made them, and those values were always the values of specific people in specific circumstances with specific interests and specific blind spots. The Athens that produced Socrates and the Parthenon and the Eleusinian Mysteries also produced the institution of slavery and the exclusion of women from civic life and the execution of Socrates. The Rome that produced the most sophisticated legal system in the ancient world also produced the gladiatorial games and the decimation and the burial alive of Vestal virgins. The Persia that produced the Cyrus cylinder and the religious tolerance policy and the royal road also produced the Zoroastrian purity rules that treated entire categories of human beings who worked with the dead as permanently contaminated. The rules were human. They were the best that specific communities of human beings could do at specific moments in their history, with the knowledge and the resources and the moral imagination that they had available. And some of what they produced was extraordinary. The Athenian democracy, with all its limitations, was the first large-scale experiment in popular self-governance in human history, and its rules about citizenship and assembly and jury trial and ostracism were genuinely new in the world. The Roman legal tradition, with all its tolerance of slavery and its class-based privileges, was the most analytically sophisticated body of law the ancient world produced, and its concepts and its distinctions and its institutional mechanisms are still at work in every civil law system on earth. The Persian policy of religious tolerance, with all its exploitation of subject peoples, was the most inclusive approach to imperial diversity that the ancient world developed, and the model it provided for governing diverse populations without requiring religious uniformity was genuinely consequential for the history of religious coexistence in the subsequent centuries. It is very late now, but Rome has more to offer before we leave it entirely, because we have examined the rules of Roman daily life and Roman law and Roman religion and Roman military organization, and we have not yet examined the rules that governed the most intimate and most revealing aspects of Roman existence. The rules about food and dining, the rules about death and commemoration, the rules about marriage and the family in their full complexity, and the rules about the specific institutions that Rome created to manage the relationship between the state and the individual in ways that had no precedent in the Greek world, and that shaped the subsequent history of political organization in the Western world more profoundly than any other single set of Roman innovations. The rules about Roman dining reveal a civilization that understood the meal as a social institution of the highest importance, and that organized every aspect of the dining experience, from the physical arrangement of the room to the sequence of courses to the seating of guests, to the entertainment provided according to rules that expressed the social hierarchy of Rome in ways that were simultaneously precise and pleasurable. The Roman triclinium, the dining room whose name derived from the 3 couches arranged in a U-shape around the central table, was not simply a place where food was consumed. It was the primary arena of social display and social bonding in the Roman aristocratic world, the space where the patron demonstrated his generosity to his clients, where alliances were formed and broken, where literary and philosophical performances were given, where the host's wealth and taste and social connections were made visible to the assembled guests. The specific rules about the arrangement of the triclinium were elaborate and seriously observed. The couches were arranged in a specific hierarchy. The place of honor was the middle couch, the lectus medius, and within that couch the specific position that was most honored was the last position on the left as you reclined, the locus consularis, the consul's place. The host occupied a specific position that allowed him to manage the flow of the dinner and to attend to his guests. The other positions were allocated according to the relative social standing of the guests, with the most honored guests in the most honored positions, and the less distinguished guests in the positions that were understood as corresponding to their lower status. A guest who was given a position that he considered below his social standing was being insulted, and the politics of seating arrangements at Roman dinner parties was a significant dimension of the social politics of the Roman elite. The rules about the sequence of courses at a Roman dinner reflected both practical considerations about the management of appetite and digestion, and the specific aesthetic theory of dining that Roman culture had developed. The gustatio, the appetizers, were designed to stimulate the appetite with small portions of strongly flavored foods including salted fish, eggs, vegetables, and other light items accompanied by a specific mixture of honey and wine called mulsum. The cena, the main course, could consist of multiple courses of increasing elaborateness and expense, depending on the wealth and the social ambitions of the host. And the secondae mensae, the dessert course, consisted of fruits and sweets and sometimes additional savory items that extended the meal and the social interaction that accompanied it. The rules about the entertainment at Roman dinner parties covered a range from the modest recitation of poetry by the host or a guest to the elaborate performances of professional entertainers that the most extravagant hosts employed. The rules about what kinds of entertainment were appropriate at a dinner party reflected the social level of the event and the relationship between the host and the guests. A philosophical discussion among intellectuals was appropriate at a dinner party of educated men. A performance by a troupe of acrobats or dancers was appropriate at a more popular entertainment. A recitation of epic poetry by a professional reciter was appropriate at a cultural event organized by a literary patron. The specific rules about what constituted appropriate entertainment at what level of Roman social life were not written down in a single code, but were enforced by the collective judgment of the social world that attended and reported on and discussed the dinner parties of the Roman elite. The rules about Roman food preservation and the management of the Roman food supply reveal a civilization that had developed sophisticated responses to the specific challenges of feeding a city of 1 million people in a pre-refrigeration world. The Roman use of garum, the fermented fish sauce that served as the primary condiment and flavor enhancer in Roman cooking, was the most distinctive feature of the Roman culinary tradition, and the product whose rules of production and quality assessment were most carefully specified. Garum was produced by fermenting small fish with salt in large ceramic vessels over a period of months, straining the resulting liquid and grading it according to its clarity, its intensity of flavor, and the specific species of fish from which it had been produced. The rules about the grades of garum were specific and the price differentials between them were significant. The finest garum, produced from the blood and organs of the mackerel in specific coastal factories in Hispania and Mauritania, commanded prices that made it a luxury commodity comparable to fine wine. The inferior grades were cheap enough to be used by ordinary Romans as an everyday condiment. The rules about the labeling and marketing of garum, about what could legitimately be called by the premium designations and what constituted fraud in the garum trade, were part of the broader Roman system of market regulation that governed the quality standards of every category of commodity traded in the Roman commercial economy. The rules about Roman death and the management of the relationship between the living and the dead were as central to Roman social organization as the rules about any other aspect of life, and they reveal a civilization that took its obligations to its dead with extraordinary seriousness, and that organized significant portions of its social and economic life around the fulfillment of those obligations. The Roman understanding of the dead was organized around the concept of the manes, the divine spirits of the deceased, whose correct treatment through the performance of specific funeral rites and the maintenance of specific commemorative practices was a genuine religious obligation that affected the well-being of the living family as well as the state of the dead. The rules about Roman funerals were specified in considerable detail and varied significantly by social class, with the funerals of the aristocratic class being elaborate public ceremonies that expressed the status of the deceased and his family as much as they honoured the dead, and the funerals of the poor being simple affairs conducted with whatever resources the family could assemble. The aristocratic Roman funeral included the display of the body in the atrium of the house for a period of days, during which visitors could pay their respects and the family demonstrated the social network that the deceased had accumulated in life. The funeral procession through the streets of Rome was a carefully organized ceremony in which actors wearing the wax death masks of the deceased's ancestors marched in the appropriate costume of the offices those ancestors had held, making visible through the procession the generations of public service that had built the family's status. The rules about the location of Roman burials reflect the specific Roman understanding of the boundary between the space of the living and the space of the dead. Roman law prohibited burial within the city limits, which meant that the necropolis, the city of the dead, was located along the roads leading out of the city, where the tombs of the wealthy and the simple markers of the less wealthy lined the approaches to every Roman city in Italy and throughout the empire. The Via Appia south of Rome was lined for several kilometers with the elaborate tombs of wealthy Roman families, each designed to express the status and the memory of its occupants in ways that would be visible to the thousands of travelers who used the road each day. The specific rules about what was to be written on a Roman tomb reveal what the Romans wanted to be remembered for and what they wanted to communicate to the strangers who passed their tombs. The formula situs est, he lies here, or hic situs est, here he lies, was the standard opening of a Roman epitaph, followed typically by the name of the deceased, his age at death, his family relationships, his public offices, and sometimes a brief expression of sentiment about the loss or the life. The abbreviation DM, dis manibus, to the divine spirits of the dead, as a dedication at the top of the epitaph was so standard that it appeared on virtually every Roman tombstone of the imperial period. And the formula HSE, hic situs est, was so universally understood that it could be abbreviated to those three letters, and any literate Roman would know what they meant. The rules about the Roman collegium, the association of citizens organized for a specific purpose, reveal one of the most important and most underappreciated institutions of Roman social life. Collegia were voluntary associations of Romans united by a common purpose, which might be the worship of a specific deity, the practice of a specific trade, residence in a specific neighborhood, or simply the desire of a group of men to dine together regularly and ensure each other proper burial. The rules about how collegia were organized, how they were governed, what they could and could not do, and how they related to the Roman state, were specified both by the internal rules of each collegium and by the general Roman law about associations. The burial collegium is one of the most historically significant types of collegium because it provided a mechanism through which people of modest means could ensure that they received the proper burial that Roman religion required, but that the family of a poor Roman might not be able to afford. Members paid regular dues into the collegium's treasury and in return received a specific burial benefit, a sum of money to cover the costs of a proper funeral, when they died. The rules about the dues, the benefit amount, the conditions under which the benefit was paid and withheld, and the governance of the collegium's treasury were specified in the collegium's charter, copies of which have survived from several Roman burial collegia, and which are among the most revealing documents of ordinary Roman social life available to historians. The rules about the Roman patron-client relationship were the rules that organized the most fundamental social institution of Roman civic life, the relationship between the powerful individual and the less powerful individuals who depended on his protection and support. The patron provided his clients with legal assistance, with recommendations for employment or contracts, with gifts of food on festival occasions, with access to his social network and his political influence. The client provided his patron with the morning salutatio, the formal greeting at the patron's door in the early morning that was both a demonstration of respect and a public expression of the patron's social standing, with political support in elections and assemblies, with companionship on public occasions, and with the general enhancement of the patron's social presence that a large and devoted clientele represented. The rules about the salutatio were specific and seriously observed by both parties. The client arrived at the patron's door in the early morning, typically before dawn, and waited with other clients for admission to the patron's presence. The order in which clients were admitted reflected their relative standing in the patron's esteem, with the most important clients admitted first and the less important waiting longer. The patron greeted each client by name, which was itself a performance of the patron's attention and respect for his client, and conducted whatever business the client had come to discuss before moving on to the next. The entire ceremony was public in the specific sense that it was observed by the other clients and by the slaves and freedmen of the household, and the quality of the patron's treatment of his clients was assessed and discussed as a reflection of his character and his social standing. The rules about the Roman census and the organization of the Roman citizen body are among the most consequential in Roman institutional history, because they were the rules through which the Roman state kept track of who its citizens were, what property they owned, and what obligations they owed in terms of military service and taxation. The census was conducted every 5 years by the censors, 2 senior magistrates elected specifically for this purpose, who were responsible for registering every Roman citizen, recording his property, assigning him to the appropriate property class, and conducting the lustrum, the purification ceremony that concluded the census and that was understood as the ritual renewal of the Roman citizen body. The specific rules about what property was to be declared in the census and how it was to be valued were developed over centuries of practice into a comprehensive system of property assessment that covered land, buildings, livestock, slaves, commercial vessels, and financial instruments. The rules about what happened to citizens who failed to register with the censors, who made false declarations about their property, or who otherwise evaded the census were severe and included the possibility of confiscation of property and reduction to slave status. The rules about the census were the foundation of the entire Roman tax and military obligation system, because both the obligation to pay taxes and the obligation to serve in the army were graduated according to the property class in which the census had placed each citizen. The rules about the Roman calendar and its management reveal a dimension of Roman civic life that connects the practical organization of time with the political authority of the institutions that maintained the calendar. The Roman calendar in its original form was a 10-month lunar calendar that required periodic intercalation of additional days by the pontifices, the college of priests responsible for the management of the calendar, in order to keep the calendar roughly aligned with the solar year. The rules about when intercalation was required, how many days were to be intercalated, and how the intercalated days were to be designated, were in the hands of the pontifices, which gave them a form of political power that was not always exercised for the purpose of accurate timekeeping. The reform of the Roman calendar by Julius Caesar in 46 before our era, the reform that produced the Julian calendar that was used throughout the Western world for the next 16 centuries, and that is still the basis of the calendar used today in the Orthodox Christian tradition, was one of the most practically consequential acts of governance in the entire history of Rome. Caesar consulted with the Alexandrian astronomer Sosidenus and produced a calendar of 365 days with a leap year every 4 years that was sufficiently close to the actual solar year to remain usable without further correction for several centuries. The rules about how the Julian calendar was organized, how the leap year was to be designated, what the names of the months were, and how dates were to be expressed using the Roman system of calends, nuns, and ides, were specified by Caesar's reform and remained the basis of Western timekeeping for a millennium and a half. The rules about Roman naming conventions reveal a social system in which a person's name was simultaneously a description of his family origin, his position within the family, and his personal identity in ways that had no exact equivalent in the Greek or Persian traditions. The standard Roman naming system for male citizens of the Republic and early empire consisted of three elements: the praenomen, the personal name that distinguished him from other members of his family; the nomen gentillicum, the family name that identified him as a member of a specific gens or clan; and the cognomen, the additional name that identified him as a member of a specific branch of the family, and that often originated in a physical characteristic, a personal quality, or an event connected to an ancestor. The rules about how names were transmitted, what names were appropriate for different social categories, and how names could be acquired through adoption, manumission, or special honor, were part of the broader social system of Roman identity. The limited number of praenomina in common use, approximately 18, meant that most Roman men shared their personal name with many other members of their family and social circle, which is why the nomen and cognomen were necessary to distinguish individuals. The cognomen Calvus meant bald, Rufus meant red-haired, Naso meant large-nosed, and Scipio meant staff, preserving in the most distinguished families of the Roman Republic the physical characteristics or the quirks of an ancestor who had lived centuries earlier. The rules about the Roman triumph that we examined earlier had a specific economic dimension that reveals how the Roman aristocratic system connected military achievement with political success, and political success with personal enrichment in ways that created powerful incentives for military expansion. A Roman general who won a triumph was entitled to keep a share of the spoils of his victory, to use the prestige of the triumph to advance his political career, and to build public monuments with his share of the spoils that would permanently commemorate his achievement and his family's glory. The rules about what portion of the spoils went to the treasury, what portion went to the soldiers, and what portion the general could retain for his own use were specified but also contested, and the management of spoils was one of the most politically sensitive aspects of Roman military command. The specific rules about how the spoils of war were displayed in the triumph and subsequently stored or distributed were elaborate and carefully specified. The most valuable objects, including works of art, precious metals, and captive royal prisoners, were displayed in the procession itself as a demonstration of the wealth and the power that Rome had extracted from its enemies. After the triumph, the precious metals went to the treasury. The works of art were displayed in public spaces or in temples, where they remained as permanent demonstrations of Roman military achievement. The captive leaders were executed at the moment when the procession reached the Capitoline Hill, and the triumphant general made his offering to Jupiter in a specific religious ceremony that connected the military victory with the divine authorization that made it meaningful. Now, as we approach the end of this long night of extraordinary rules from Greece and Persia and the Hellenistic world and Rome, there is one final category of rules that deserves careful attention before we rest. The rules about what happened to the Roman world when the empire that had produced all the other rules we have examined began to change in ways that transformed not just Rome, but the entire subsequent history of the Western world. The rules about the relationship between Rome and Christianity are the rules that produced the world that came after Rome, and they reveal with particular clarity the way in which rule systems can be transformed by the encounter with ideas that they were not designed to accommodate. The rules of the early Christian community were rules about how a small group of people who believed that the world was about to end, that the kingdom of God was imminent, and that the correct response to this imminence was a specific form of radical ethical commitment, could organize their communal life in the meantime. The rules in the letters of Paul, in the Didache, in the early church orders that survive from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, covered the management of the communal meal that was the primary institution of early Christian community life, the resolution of disputes between community members without recourse to the Roman legal system, the treatment of widows and orphans and the poor, the management of prophecy and ecstatic speech in community gatherings, and the specific ethical obligations that Christian identity imposed. The rules about the Roman persecution of Christians and the rules about Christian conduct under persecution are both illuminating about the specific nature of the conflict between the early church and the Roman state. The Roman rules required the performance of specific public rituals that expressed loyalty to the Roman order, and the Christian rules prohibited the performance of those same rituals as incompatible with the exclusive loyalty to God that the first commandment required. The persecution was therefore not a conflict between Roman tyranny and Christian freedom in the simple sense that later Christian historiography sometimes presented it. It was a conflict between two different rule systems, each internally coherent, each making demands that the other's rules made impossible to fulfill. The conversion of the Emperor Constantine in 312 of our era, and the subsequent transformation of Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into the official religion of the Roman Empire, was one of the most consequential rule changes in the history of the Western world. The rules that governed the relationship between the Christian Church and the Roman state were completely rewritten over the course of the 4th century, as Christianity moved from being an illegal association whose members could be executed for their beliefs, to being the religion of the empire whose leaders were given legal privileges, tax exemptions, and political authority that transformed the church from a community of believers into an institution of governance. The rules that the Council of Nicaea in 325 produced about the correct understanding of the nature of Christ, about the authority of bishops to define orthodox doctrine, about the relationship between the different regional churches of the empire, and about the procedures for resolving theological disputes within the church, were rules of the same kind as the rules of the Roman Senate and the Roman law, institutional rules designed to manage the conflicts and coordinate the activities of a large and diverse organization that was rapidly acquiring the functions and the authority of a state institution. The theological precision of the Nicene Creed, the specific formulations about the relationship between the Father and the Son that were chosen to exclude the Arian position that Christ was a created being subordinate to the Father, were rules about what was thinkable within the framework of Christian theology and what was excluded from it, enforced by the same combination of theological argument and imperial authority that enforced every other rule of the late Roman state. And here at the very end of this longest of long nights, with the Roman Empire and the early Christian Church and the entire ancient world behind us, we arrive at the place where the history becomes the world we live in. The rules of Athens and Sparta and Persia and the Hellenistic kingdoms and Rome and the early Church did not simply end when the political entities that produced them ended. They dissolved into the inheritance of the medieval world and the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the modern period, carrying their specific logics and their specific assumptions and their specific blind spots into every subsequent civilization that claimed any relationship to the Western tradition. The democratic rules of Athens dissolved into the Roman Republican tradition, and through it into every subsequent Western theory of popular self-governance. The Roman legal rules dissolved into the canon law of the medieval church, and through it into the civil law systems of continental Europe and their descendants in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The Stoic philosophical rules about the natural law that applied to all human beings regardless of their citizenship dissolved into the natural rights tradition that produced the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Persian rules about religious tolerance dissolved into the Islamic millet system, and through it into the modern concept of minority religious rights. The Jewish rules about scriptural interpretation that developed in the period of Roman rule dissolved into the Islamic tradition of Quranic interpretation, and through it into every subsequent tradition of sacred textual commentary. We inherit all of these rules, not as intact systems that we can simply apply to our current circumstances, but as the accumulated, transformed, contested, partially preserved, partially forgotten, partially misremembered legacy of the civilizations that produced them. We carry the rules without always knowing we carry them. We apply the rules without always knowing where they came from. And we violate the rules without always knowing what we are losing. The rules were strange. They were human. They were the best that specific communities of human beings could do at specific moments in their history. And some of what they produced was extraordinary. Extraordinary enough that we are still talking about it, still arguing about it, still trying to understand it, still being shaped by it. 2,500 years after the first Athenian citizen cast his ostracon in the spring sunshine and the oracle at Delphi delivered her ambiguous pronouncement to the waiting questioner, and the Persian royal messenger changed his horse at the relay station on the royal road, and continued without pause toward his destination. It is very late now, the last late it will be for tonight. The Athenian citizen is sleeping. The Roman soldier is sleeping. The Persian messenger has arrived. The Vestal Virgin has completed her vigil and will tend the fire again at dawn. The philosopher is sleeping the deep sleep of someone who has spent his entire conscious life thinking about the most important questions he could find, and who has not yet found the answers, but who will begin again tomorrow. All of them rest now, and you rest with them, under the same sky, with the same stars above, in the same world that has been made and unmade and made again by the extraordinary, ordinary human project of creating rules that are worth living by. Sleep well. You have travelled far tonight. The ancient world is quiet now. The rules have finished for tonight, and the rest that waits at the end of every long journey has finally arrived. But there is one more civilization that demands our attention before this night is complete, because we have travelled through Greece and Persia and the Hellenistic world and Rome, and we have not yet visited the civilization that was Rome's greatest rival, the civilization that Rome feared more than any other, the civilization whose military genius came closer to ending Rome than any other force in the ancient world, and whose rules about war and commerce and civic life and the relationship between human beings and their gods were genuinely different from Rome's in ways that reveal the specific character of each civilization more clearly than any internal examination could. We have not yet visited Carthage. Carthage is the great absence of ancient history. The civilization that Cato the Elder obsessively demanded be destroyed. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. The civilization that produced Hannibal Barca, the greatest general of the ancient world, the civilization whose merchant ships reached the coasts of West Africa and possibly the British Isles centuries before anyone else in the Mediterranean world, has left us almost nothing of its own voice. The Romans destroyed it so completely in 146 before our era that virtually no Carthaginian documents, no Carthaginian histories, no Carthaginian literature of any kind has survived. What we know about Carthaginian rules and Carthaginian life comes almost entirely from Roman and Greek sources, which were almost uniformly hostile, and from the archaeological evidence that modern excavation has recovered from the ruins of the city itself. This absence is itself one of the most revealing facts about the ancient Mediterranean world. Rome destroyed Carthage so completely, salted the earth of the site according to some accounts, though this specific detail is disputed by modern historians, and worked so effectively to eliminate any surviving record of Carthaginian civilization that the people who built the most successful commercial empire in the Western Mediterranean for 6 centuries before Rome's rise are known to us primarily through the eyes of the enemies who erased them. The rules that governed Carthaginian life are therefore rules that we must approach with the understanding that our sources for them had every reason to misrepresent them, and that the misrepresentations have been accepted as fact for so long that separating the genuine historical record from the propaganda of the victors is genuinely difficult. The rules about Carthaginian commerce were organized around a commercial philosophy and a commercial practice that were genuinely different from the Greek and Roman approaches, and that reflected the specific origin of Carthage as a Phoenician colony whose founding population brought with them the maritime commercial traditions of the Phoenician cities of the Levantine coast. Carthage was founded, according to tradition, around 814 before our era as a trading colony of the Phoenician city of Tyre, and its entire subsequent history as a civilization was organized around the commercial imperative of controlling the western Mediterranean trade routes that connected the metal-rich territories of Iberia and the tin-producing territories of the British Isles with the manufactured goods and the agricultural surpluses of the eastern Mediterranean world. The rules about Carthaginian commercial treaties were among the most carefully observed in the ancient world. The series of commercial treaties between Carthage and Rome that Polybius records, covering the late 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries before our era, specified with considerable precision which territories each party was permitted to trade in, what conditions applied to merchants of each party operating in the other's sphere of influence, and what happened when merchants violated the territorial restrictions the treaties imposed. The rules were the expression of a commercial philosophy that understood the Western Mediterranean as a space to be organized for maximum commercial efficiency through agreed territorial divisions, rather than as a space to be conquered for political dominance. The Carthaginian commercial network at its height controlled the trade of the Western Mediterranean in ways that had no parallel in the ancient world outside China. Carthaginian merchants operated trading posts along the coasts of North Africa, Iberia, Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily. Carthaginian ships dominated the commercial routes between these trading posts and the larger markets of the eastern Mediterranean, and the rules that governed access to the commercial network about who could trade in which areas under what conditions and what exclusions applied to competitors from other civilizations were the rules that made the network function and that Carthage enforced through a combination of commercial diplomacy, the maintenance of a powerful navy, and when necessary direct military action against competitors who attempted to violate the territorial arrangements. The rules about the Carthaginian Sophetes, the two annually elected magistrates who served as the chief executives of the Carthaginian state, reveal a republican form of government that was in some respects more genuinely oligarchic than the Athenian democracy, but that shared with it the fundamental commitment to rule through deliberative institutions rather than through the personal authority of a single ruler. The Sophetes were elected annually, could not succeed themselves immediately, and exercised their authority in conjunction with a council of elders, the Gerousia, and a popular assembly whose specific powers and limitations were organized in ways that Aristotle, who examined the Carthaginian constitution with genuine admiration in his Politics, described as a mixed constitution that had successfully balanced the competing claims of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy in ways that had produced the political stability that allowed Carthage to prosper for centuries without the internal upheavals that had disrupted Greek political life. The rules about the Carthaginian military system reveal a commercial civilization's specific approach to the problem of war, which was to treat military force as a professional service that could be purchased rather than as a civic obligation that citizens were required to perform. Carthage's army was primarily mercenary, recruited from the diverse peoples of the Western Mediterranean, Iberian warriors, Numidian cavalry, Libyan infantry, Balearic slingers, and Celtic fighters from Gaul and Iberia, each fighting in their traditional styles under their traditional commanders, but organized and directed by Carthaginian officers toward Carthaginian strategic objectives. The rules about the recruitment, the payment, the treatment, and the management of the mercenary forces were the rules of a labour market in violence, with specific rates for specific categories of service, specific performance expectations, specific bonuses for exceptional performance, and specific penalties for failure or desertion. The mercenary system was one of Carthage's greatest strategic strengths and one of its greatest vulnerabilities. A mercenary army that was well paid and well led was formidably effective, as Hannibal's campaigns in Italy demonstrated. But a mercenary army that was poorly paid, that felt its employers had violated the terms of its contract, was a mercenary army that could become the enemy of the city it had been hired to protect. As the mercenary war of 241 to 238 before our era demonstrated, when the mercenaries who had fought for Carthage in the First Punic War turned against their employers in a brutal 3-year conflict after Carthage defaulted on their pay. The rules about Hannibal Barca and his campaigns reveal a military genius operating within a set of strategic constraints that were imposed by the specific character of the Carthaginian state and the specific rules by which it conducted its military affairs. Hannibal's campaign in Italy, which began in 218 before our era, when he led his army across the Alps with its famous complement of war elephants, and which produced 3 of the greatest tactical victories in ancient military history, at the Trebia, at Lake Trasimena, and at Cannae, was a campaign that was simultaneously the most brilliant military operation in the history of the ancient world, and a strategic failure that ended in the destruction of Carthage. The rules about what Hannibal could and could not do were rules about the relationship between a field commander and the civilian government that had sent him on his mission. Hannibal could win battles, he could devastate the Italian countryside, he could detach Rome's Italian allies from their loyalty to Rome. What he could not do, under the rules by which the Carthaginian state had organized the campaign, was conduct a successful siege of a major fortified city without siege equipment, which was not provided, and without the reinforcements that he repeatedly requested, and that the Carthaginian government repeatedly failed to send in sufficient quantities. The rules that defined Hannibal's mission, that gave him the strategic objective of breaking the Roman-Italian alliance, without giving him the resources to achieve that objective by the most direct means available, were the rules that made the most brilliant tactical mind of the ancient world into a strategic failure. The specific rules about the organization of the Battle of Cannae in 216 before our era, in which Hannibal destroyed a Roman army of approximately 80,000 men with a force of approximately 50,000 in what military historians have called the most perfectly executed battle in the history of warfare, are worth examining in detail because they reveal a military intelligence of the highest order, translating a simple geometric principle into a catastrophic tactical result. Hannibal arranged his weakest troops, the Gallic and Spanish infantry, in the center of his line, and his strongest troops, the African heavy infantry and the Numidian cavalry, on the wings. The Roman army advanced against the center, driving it back in the precisely controlled retreat that Hannibal had designed, and as the center bent backward under the Roman pressure, the wings closed inward in a double envelopment that surrounded the entire Roman army and compressed it into a space so tight that men could no longer use their weapons. They were simply crushed, stabbed, and suffocated by the pressure of the troops around them. The rules that Hannibal had designed for the battle were rules about the management of the relationship between the specific capabilities of each unit and the overall geometry of the trap he was constructing. The Gallic and Spanish infantry had to retreat in a controlled way without breaking, which required discipline of a specific kind. The African infantry on the wings had to advance at precisely the right moment to complete the encirclement, which required coordination and judgment of a specific kind. The cavalry on each wing had to defeat the Roman cavalry opposing them, and then turned to complete the encirclement from the rear, which required the speed and the tactical flexibility that the Numidian horsemen possessed in exceptional degree. Every element of the battle plan was calibrated to the specific capabilities of the specific troops Hannibal had available, and the result was a tactical masterpiece that has been studied in every military academy in the world for the past 2,000 years. The rules about the Punic religion and the specific practices that Roman propaganda associated with Carthage reveal the specific nature of the propaganda war that Rome conducted against its greatest rival, and the difficulty of separating historical fact from hostile invention in the sources we have. The claim that the Carthaginians practiced the sacrifice of children, the Tophet sacrifice in which infants were burned as offerings to the gods Baal Hamon and Tanit, was one of the most inflammatory accusations in the Roman rhetorical arsenal and one of the most contested in modern scholarship. The archaeological evidence from the Tophet, the sacred precinct outside Carthage where urns containing the burned bones of children and animals were deposited in large numbers over many centuries, is real and undisputed. What is disputed is the interpretation of that evidence, whether it represents the sacrifice of living children, as the Roman and Greek sources claim, or the secondary deposition of children who had died from natural causes and who were given a special honoured burial in the sacred precinct, as some modern scholars argue. The dispute about the Tophet is not simply an academic question about the interpretation of ambiguous archaeological evidence. It is a question about what the Carthaginians were, about what kind of civilization Rome destroyed, about whether the destruction of Carthage was the elimination of a genuinely barbaric practice or the elimination of a sophisticated commercial civilization whose specific religious practices were no more brutal than the gladiatorial games and the decimation and the burial alive of Vestal virgins that Rome itself institutionalized. The rules of the Tophet, whatever they actually were rules that the Carthaginians themselves understood as expressions of their relationship with their gods, as obligations imposed by divine demand that the correct performance of the cult required. The horror that Roman observers expressed at them, genuine or performative, reflected the specific Roman framework for evaluating religious practice, a framework in which the offering of human beings to the gods was categorically unacceptable in ways that the offering of human beings to the entertainment of the crowd was apparently not. The destruction of Carthage in 146 before our era was one of the most deliberate and most complete acts of cultural erasure in the ancient world, and the specific rules by which it was conducted reveal the Roman understanding of what total victory required, and what the elimination of a civilizational rival entailed. The Roman Senate debated for years whether Carthage should be conquered and made a subject city, or whether it should be physically eliminated, and the eventual decision in favor of elimination was a decision to remove from the world not just a political entity, but a way of organizing commercial life, a set of religious practices, a language and a literature, and a tradition of civic governance that had persisted for 7 centuries. The rules of the destruction, the specific procedures by which the city was dismantled stone by stone, and its population killed or enslaved, and its site declared accursed, were the rules of a civilization deciding that the existence of an alternative was intolerable. And now, with Carthage and its extraordinary rules about commerce and military genius and the terrible ambiguity of the Tophet, we have finally arrived at the end of tonight's journey through the ancient world. We have travelled from Athens to Sparta to Persia to the Hellenistic kingdoms, to Rome, to the Stoics in their philosophical schools, to the Vestals tending their sacred fire, to the Pythagoreans refusing their beans, to the gladiators waiting for the crowd's decision, to the Carthaginian merchants navigating the western Mediterranean, to Hannibal crossing the Alps, to the council that decided that Carthage must be destroyed. What connects all of these rules, from the most philosophically elevated to the most practically mundane, from the most humane to the most terrible, from the most brilliantly conceived to the most catastrophically misapplied, is something that is at once very simple and very difficult to fully grasp. Every one of these rule systems was made by human beings who were trying to do the same thing. They were trying to understand the world they lived in, and to create within that world the conditions under which their specific community, with its specific values and its specific fears and its specific ambitions, could survive and flourish and produce the things that made life worth living. The Athenians tried to create the conditions for a specific form of human excellence, the excellence of the citizen who participated fully in the political and cultural and intellectual life of a community that valued those things. The Spartans tried to create the conditions for a different form of human excellence, the excellence of the soldier who had been so thoroughly shaped by his training, that courage and discipline and obedience to the community were not achievements he had to struggle toward, but simply descriptions of what he was. The Persians tried to create the conditions for the management of an extraordinary diversity of peoples and traditions within a single political framework that could extract what it needed from each without destroying what made each distinctive. The Romans tried to create the conditions for the organized extension of a specific form of political order across the largest territory that any Western civilization had ever governed. And the Carthaginians tried to create the conditions for the organized pursuit of commercial prosperity across the widest possible network of trading connections. All of them succeeded, at least for a while, and in ways that were specific to their specific ambitions. All of them failed eventually, in ways that were also specific to the specific weaknesses that their specific ambitions created. The Athenian democracy that produced Socrates and the Parthenon also produced the trial and execution of Socrates and the Sicilian expedition and the eventual defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. The Spartan military machine that stopped the Persians at Thermopylae also produced the institution that annually declared war on its own enslaved population, and that eventually ran out of the men its whole system was designed to produce. The Persian Empire that produced the Cyrus cylinder also produced Xerxes' burning of the Athenian Acropolis. The Roman Republic that produced the most sophisticated legal tradition in the ancient world also produced the civil wars that destroyed it. And Carthage, the civilization of Hannibal and the Western Mediterranean trade network, and the centuries of republican governance, was destroyed so completely that we cannot even read its own account of what it was. The rules are all that survive, not intact, not complete, not as living systems that we can simply transplant into our own circumstances, but as fragments and residues and transformed descendants that are still at work in the world, still shaping what is thinkable and what is unthinkable, still defining the boundaries of the possible in ways that we often do not recognize as having any history at all. The concept of the individual as the bearer of rights that no community can legitimately take away is a Stoic idea that traveled through Roman jurisprudence, through medieval natural law, through early modern political philosophy, to the modern concept of human rights, the concept of popular sovereignty, the idea that political authority derives from the consent of the governed, rather than from divine appointment or hereditary right, is an Athenian idea that traveled through Roman republican theory, through Renaissance humanism, through Enlightenment political philosophy, to the modern democratic tradition. The concept of the rule of law, the idea that even the most powerful persons in a community are bound by the same rules as everyone else and cannot legitimately place themselves above those rules, is a Roman idea that travelled through the medieval common law tradition, through the constitutional struggles of the 17th century, to the modern principle of constitutional government. We are the descendants of these rules, not because we have simply inherited them unchanged. We have not. The journey from the Athenian ekklesia to the modern democracy is a journey of 2.5 millennia, during which the original idea was transformed almost beyond recognition by contact with every other idea and every other circumstance it encountered along the way. But the original idea is still there, underneath all the transformations, still providing the foundation on which everything built above it depends. The rules were strange. To us, looking back across 2,500 years of history, the rules of Athens and Sparta and Persia and Rome and Carthage are strange in ways that illuminate what is specific about our own rules, what is contingent about the things we take as natural, what is historical about the things we treat as inevitable. That strangeness is not a reason to dismiss them or to celebrate them uncritically. It is a reason to look at them carefully, to try to understand them on their own terms before we evaluate them by ours, to recognize in their extraordinary variety the evidence that there have always been multiple ways of being human and multiple answers to the question of what a good life and a just community require. The rules were human, every one of them, made by human beings with the same fundamental needs and the same fundamental limitations and the same fundamental capacity for both extraordinary achievement and extraordinary cruelty that characterizes our species in every time and every place. The Athenian who voted in the ekklesia, and the Spartan mother who told her son to come back with his shield or on it, and the Persian official who maintained the royal road, and the Roman soldier who built his camp, and the Vestal virgin who tended the sacred fire, and the Carthaginian merchant who navigated the western Mediterranean, were all fully human in the same way that we are fully human. Their rules were different from ours. Their humanity was not. It is very late now, later than it has ever been in any of our nights together. The ancient world is completely at rest. The Athenian agora is empty and silent in the pre-dawn darkness. The Spartan barracks are quiet. The Persian royal road carries no traffic at this hour. The Roman thermae are closed, and the sacred fire in the temple of Vesta burns low, but does not go out. The ruins of Carthage are silent under the North African stars, keeping whatever secrets they have kept for 2,000 years, since the Romans tried to erase them from the world. All of them rest now. The rule makers and the rule breakers and the rule keepers and the rule violators and the rule interpreters and the people who lived and died and loved and suffered and achieved extraordinary things and failed in terrible ways within the frameworks that the rules created. All of them rest under the same sky that is above you now, with the same stars overhead that guided the Phoenician merchant ships across the Mediterranean and the Persian royal messengers along the royal road and the Roman soldiers to the edges of the world they were trying to govern. You rest with them tonight. You have earned it. You have travelled farther tonight than most people travel in a year of ordinary reading, through civilizations that produce between them almost everything that the modern Western world understands itself to be descended from. You have met the rules that built the world you live in. Some of them are still at work in you in ways you may not have recognized before tonight. Some of them were abandoned long ago, and their abandonment was a genuine human achievement. And some of them are still being argued about, still being applied and contested and reinterpreted, in the same spirit of inquiry that the first Athenian, who stood up in the ecclesia and said, "Let me tell you what I think," was expressing. The inquiry continues. The rules will continue to be made and broken and argued about and enforced and violated and revised and inherited and transformed as long as human beings live together in communities and face the question of what they owe to each other, but not tonight. Tonight the inquiry rests. Tonight the ancient world and all its extraordinary rules are quiet. Tonight the sleep that has been waiting patiently at the edge of this very long story has finally arrived to claim you. Sleep well. You have been in the company of some of the most remarkable civilizations that the ancient world produced. Their rules shaped the world you live in. Their humanity is your humanity. Their questions are your questions. And their rest, finally, is your rest. Sleep well, sleep deeply. The rules will be here in the morning.